The moments change your life forever, and you never see them coming. Sometimes it takes losing everything to find what you never knew you needed. In 1884, Jacob Whitmore rode into Copper Creek for supplies, planning to be gone by morning. He'd lived 15 years alone in the Montana mountains, trusting no one. But when he saw a young woman in a torn wedding dress searching through trash for food, everything changed. Her name was Sarah, and she'd been abandoned at the altar with nothing but heartbreak and an empty stomach. Jacob had forgotten how to care about anyone but himself. Sarah had given up on believing anyone would care about her. When their paths crossed on that snowy street, neither expected to find hope again. But could a hardened mountain man learn to open his heart to a woman who'd lost faith in love itself? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The winter wind cut through Copper Creek like a blade, carrying the scent of wood smoke and the promise of a harsh night ahead. Jacob Whitmore pulled his worn coat tighter as he guided his packhorse down Main Street, the animal's breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. 15 years had passed since he'd last called any place home, and these supply runs to civilization were the only reminders that a world beyond his mountain cabin still existed. His father's leather journal, wrapped carefully in oiled cloth and tucked inside his saddlebags, contained everything he needed to survive: weather patterns, animal behaviors, medicinal plants, and the hard-won wisdom of a man who'd carved a life from wilderness. Jacob had memorized every page, but he still carried it like a talisman, the only connection to the family he'd lost so long ago. The town hadn't changed much since his last visit 6 months prior. Same weathered storefronts, same suspicious glances from townsfolk who saw his buckskins and long hair and knew immediately he was one of those mountain hermits. They tolerated him because his money was good and his pelts were prime, but they'd never understand the peace he'd found in solitude. Jacob tied his horse outside Mackenzie's general store and stepped onto the wooden sidewalk, his boots echoing hollow against the planks. Through the frost-covered window, he could see old Mackenzie arranging goods behind the counter, probably calculating how much he could overcharge the mountain man who had few other options. That's when he saw her, across the street. Behind the mercantile, a figure in white knelt in the snow beside a collection of wooden crates and barrels. At first glance, Jacob thought it might be someone's laundry that had blown free. But as his eyes adjusted to the dim afternoon light, he realized it was a woman in what looked like a wedding dress. Though the fabric was torn and stained with mud, she was searching through refuse with desperate fingers, her movements quick and furtive like a wounded animal afraid of being discovered. Her dark hair had escaped whatever arrangement it had once held, falling in tangles around her shoulders. Even from this distance, Jacob could see the sharp angles of her face, the hollow cheeks that spoke of too many meals missed, something twisted in his chest, an emotion he'd buried so deep he'd forgotten its name. Compassion, maybe, or recognition. He'd known hunger himself in those early days on the mountain when pride had nearly killed him and winter had shown no mercy. The woman found something, a crust of bread, perhaps, or a scrap of dried meat, and clutched it to her chest with both hands. For a moment, she closed her eyes, and Jacob saw her lips move in what might have been a prayer of gratitude. The sight hit him harder than any physical blow he'd ever taken. He'd planned to conduct his business quickly and be gone before nightfall. His cabin waited 40 miles north, stocked with enough provisions to last until spring. He had his books, his traps, his solitude. Everything a man needed to live quietly and die, forgotten. But something about the woman's desperate grace, the way she treated that scrap of refuse like a feast, made him hesitate. Jacob had spent 15 years avoiding complications, steering clear of other people's problems. He'd learned the hard way that caring about others led to loss, and loss led to the kind of pain that could break a man's spirit permanently. Still, he found himself walking across the muddy street. She looked up as his shadow fell across her, those dark eyes wide with alarm. She was younger than he'd first thought, maybe 25, but life had already etched lines of worry around her eyes. The wedding dress, once pristine white satin, was now a patchwork of stains and tears that told a story Jacob didn't want to imagine. "Ma'am," he said quietly, keeping his distance so as not to frighten her further. "Begging your pardon, but are you all right?" She scrambled to her feet, clutching the morsel of food protectively. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice shook with cold and something else. "Pride, maybe. Just looking for something I dropped." Jacob's weathered hands stayed relaxed at his sides, his voice gentle, in the way he'd learned to speak to spooked horses. "Name's Jacob Whitmore. Don't mean any harm. Just wondered if you might be hungry." Her composure cracked then, just slightly. She looked down at the torn fabric of her dress, at her muddy hands, at the evidence of her desperation scattered around the refuse pile. When she met his eyes again, he saw something there that reminded him of his own reflection in mountain streams, the look of someone who'd lost everything that mattered. "Sarah," she whispered. "Sarah Mitchell. And yes, I suppose I am hungry." The admission seemed to cost her everything. She swayed slightly, and Jacob stepped forward instinctively, his hand reaching out to steady her. She didn't pull away, which told him more about her situation than words could have. "When did you last eat?" he asked. Sarah considered lying. He could see the impulse flash across her face, but exhaustion won over pride. "Yesterday morning. Maybe the day before. It gets hard to track." Jacob nodded toward the Golden Creek Inn, its yellow windows promising warmth and hot meals. "Would you allow me to buy you supper?" She stared at him as if he'd offered her the moon. Why? It was a fair question, and one Jacob couldn't answer fully without examining motivations he preferred to keep buried. "Because I remember what hungry feels like," he said simply. "And because no one should have to search for food in the cold." Sarah looked back at the refuse pile, then at the inn, then at Jacob's weathered face. He waited patiently while she wrestled with whatever pride she had left. "I can't pay you back," she said finally. "Didn't ask you to." She studied him for a long moment, taking in the worn but clean buckskins, the honest lines around his eyes, the patient way he stood without crowding her. Whatever she saw there seemed to reassure her. "All right," she said. "Thank you." As they walked toward the inn, Jacob caught glimpses of the woman beneath the desperate circumstances. She held herself with unconscious grace despite her torn dress, stepped carefully around puddles to avoid splashing mud on others, and nodded politely to the few townsfolk they passed, though most looked away quickly, uncomfortable with her obvious distress. The Golden Creek Inn sat at the corner of Main and Prospect Streets, a two-story building that had seen better days, but still promised decent food and clean beds. Martha Hennessy, the proprietress, looked up from behind the front desk as they entered, her grey eyebrows rising at the unlikely pair. "Evening, Mr. Whitmore," she said, her tone carefully neutral. Martha had always been fair to him, if not exactly warm. "Wasn't expecting to see you again so soon." "Evening, Martha. Wondering if you might have a table available for supper." Martha's eyes moved to Sarah, taking in the ruined wedding dress and hollow cheeks. Her expression softened immediately, a reminder that for all their small-town suspicions, most folks in Copper Creek had decent hearts. "Of course," she said. "Right this way." She led them to a small table near the fireplace, away from the few other diners who had paused their conversations to stare. Jacob helped Sarah into her chair, noting how gratefully she leaned toward the warmth of the flames. "What can I bring you folks?" Martha asked, though her eyes remained on Sarah with obvious concern. "Whatever's hottest," Jacob said, "and plenty of it." As Martha bustled away, Sarah sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. Up close, in the firelight, Jacob could see more clearly what she'd been through. Her knuckles were scraped raw, probably from searching through rough surfaces. Her lips were chapped and slightly blue from cold. But beneath the evidence of hardship, she possessed a natural beauty that poverty couldn't diminish. Fine bone structure, expressive dark eyes, and an elegance that spoke of better times. "You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to," Jacob said gently. "But if you'd like to talk, I'm willing to listen." Sarah was quiet for so long he thought she might not respond. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I was supposed to be married 3 days ago to Thomas Garrett, a man I'd been corresponding with for 6 months. He'd sent for me from back east, paid my travel expenses, promised me a good life." She paused, staring into the fire. "When I arrived, he took one look at me, decided I wasn't what he'd expected, and disappeared with the dowry money my aunt had given me. All of it, everything I had in the world." Jacob felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his voice calm. "What about family? Friends? Dead or scattered?" Sarah's laugh held no humor. "My parents died of influenza 2 years ago. My aunt passed last spring. That's when I decided to answer Thomas's advertisement. I thought I was being practical, smart even. A marriage of convenience that might grow into something more." Martha returned with 2 steaming bowls of beef stew and fresh bread, setting them down with motherly care. "You eat every bit of that, dear," she told Sarah quietly. "And if you need anything else, you just ask." Sarah's eyes filled with tears at the simple kindness. She picked up her spoon with shaking hands and took a small, careful bite, as if she couldn't quite believe the food was real. Jacob ate slowly, watching as she gradually relaxed, color returning to her cheeks as warmth and nourishment did their work. He found himself studying the graceful way she held her spoon, the unconscious propriety in her posture despite her circumstances. This was a woman who'd been raised well, educated, taught to conduct herself as a lady, even when the world had stripped away everything that should have protected her. "What will you do now?" he asked when she'd finished half her bowl. Sarah set down her spoon and met his eyes. "I don't know," she admitted. "I have no money for travel, no prospects, no references for employment. The sheriff said I could stay in town a few more days, but after that—" She shrugged helplessly. "Winter's no time to be wandering," Jacob observed. "No," she agreed. "It's not." They finished their meal in comfortable silence, the crackling fire providing a peaceful soundtrack to their thoughts. Jacob found himself reluctant to leave, though he couldn't quite understand why. Perhaps it was simply that he'd forgotten how pleasant it could be to share a meal with another person, to sit in warm companionship without the need for constant conversation. When Martha brought coffee, Sarah wrapped her hands around the cup as if it were precious. "Mr. Whitmore," she said hesitantly, "why did you help me? You don't know anything about me. I could be anyone." Jacob considered the question seriously. "I suppose," he said slowly, "because everyone deserves kindness when they're down. And because—" He paused, surprised by his own honesty. "Because I spent too many years being angry at the world to ignore someone who needs help." "You were angry?" "For a long time, yes. Lost some people I cared about. Decided it was easier to live alone than risk that kind of pain again." Sarah nodded, as if she understood perfectly. "And now?" Jacob looked into his coffee cup, seeing his own reflection in the dark surface. "Now I think maybe anger's just another kind of prison." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and reminding them both that the world beyond the inn's warm walls was harsh and unforgiving. Jacob glanced toward the front desk, where Martha was arranging keys and ledger books for the evening. "Martha," he called softly, "you got a room available for the lady?" "I do," Martha replied, "but I'm afraid—" "I'll settle the bill," Jacob said quickly. "And meals for as long as she needs them." Sarah's eyes widened. "Mr. Whitmore, I can't possibly accept such generosity. I have no way to repay you." "Then don't think of it as debt," Jacob said. "Think of it as one person helping another through a hard time. We all need that sometimes." Martha approached their table with a room key, her expression both pleased and concerned. "Room 7, upstairs at the end of the hall. It's got a good view of the mountains, and the fireplace draws well." Sarah accepted the key with trembling fingers. "Thank you," she whispered, "both of you." "I don't know what to say." "Nothing needs saying," Jacob replied, standing as she rose from her chair. "You get some rest. Tomorrow we can figure out what comes next." As Sarah climbed the narrow stairs to her room, Jacob remained in the lobby, staring out at the snow that had begun to fall more heavily. His pack horse waited patiently outside, loaded with supplies for the return journey to his cabin. He should leave now before the weather worsened. He had everything he'd come for, but as he listened to Sarah's footsteps overhead, heard the soft sound of her door closing, Jacob realized that for the first time in 15 years, he wasn't quite ready to return to his solitary mountain home. Jacob woke before dawn in the small room he'd taken at the inn, his internal clock still tuned to mountain rhythms. Through the thin walls, he could hear the building settling in the cold, the distant sound of Martha stoking the kitchen fire downstairs. He'd intended to be on the trail by first light, but something had changed in the few hours since he'd watched Sarah climb those stairs. He dressed quietly and made his way to the dining room, where Martha was already setting out plates for breakfast. The older woman looked up with a knowing expression that made him slightly uncomfortable. "She's been awake for hours," Martha said without preamble. "Heard her moving around up there before the sun rose. Poor thing's probably not used to sleeping in a real bed anymore." Jacob poured himself coffee from the pot Martha kept ready and took a seat at the same table where he'd shared supper with Sarah. Through the window, he could see his packhorse standing patiently in the stable yard, breath steaming in the morning air. The animal seemed to be waiting, just as Jacob was, though for what, neither could say. Footsteps on the stairs announced Sarah's arrival. She'd managed to clean up considerably. Her dark hair was neatly braided, and she'd brushed most of the mud from her wedding dress. But the garment remained a sorry sight, the torn fabric and stains telling their story of abandonment and desperation. She moved carefully, as if afraid to impose on the space around her. "Good morning," she said quietly, her voice carrying the careful politeness of someone who understood she was living on borrowed kindness. "Morning," Jacob replied, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Martha's got biscuits and eggs coming." Sarah sat down, her hands folded in her lap. In the morning light, he could see she wore a simple gold band on her left hand, a wedding ring that had never been blessed by vows. The sight of it stirred something angry in Jacob's chest. "You still wearing that?" he asked, nodding toward the ring. Sarah's fingers moved instinctively to cover it. "I suppose I should take it off, but it was my mother's before I had it sized for the wedding. It's the only thing I have left of her." "Then you keep it," Jacob said firmly. "But maybe not on that finger." Understanding flickered in her eyes, and she slipped the ring from her left hand to her right. Such a small gesture, but Jacob could see it meant something to her, a step away from the identity of abandoned bride toward something new. Martha bustled over with plates of food, steam rising from scrambled eggs and fresh biscuits. "Eat up, both of you," she commanded in the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Storm's coming in, and it looks to be a hard one." Through the window, Jacob could see dark clouds gathering over the mountains, the kind of formation that meant serious weather. His experienced eye read the signs easily. They'd have snow by noon, heavy enough to make travel dangerous. "I should get on the trail," he said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "In this weather?" Martha shook her head. "Jacob Whitmore, I've known you for 5 years and you're many things, but you're not foolish. You'll wait until this passes." Sarah looked between them, confusion evident on her face. "Is it really so dangerous?" "Mountain storms can turn deadly fast," Jacob explained. "Wind, snow, temperature drops that'll freeze a man solid in his saddle. I've seen it happen to folks who thought they knew better." The truth was, Jacob had weathered worse storms than the one brewing outside. His cabin was well stocked, and he knew every trail between Copper Creek and home. But as he watched Sarah carefully portion out her breakfast, making the food last as long as possible, he found reasons to delay his departure. "I'll stay another day," he decided aloud, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. Relief flickered across Sarah's face so quickly he almost missed it. She'd been dreading the moment when her protector would leave. Though she was too proud to ask him to stay, after breakfast, Jacob found himself walking with Sarah through the town's modest business district. The morning was still clear, though the approaching storm made the air heavy with anticipation. Sarah moved beside him with unconscious grace, nodding politely to the few people they passed. though Jacob noticed how most folks' eyes lingered on her ruined wedding dress. They stopped in front of Pemberton's dry goods, where bolts of fabric and ready-made clothing filled the front window. Sarah stared at a simple blue dress displayed on a wooden form, her expression wistful. "That would suit you," Jacob observed. "It's beautiful," Sarah agreed. "But I can't. I mean, you've already done so much." Jacob pushed open the shop door without answering, the bell above jingling their arrival. Mrs. Pemberton, a round woman with kind eyes and greying hair, looked up from her account ledger. "Mr. Whitmore," she said warmly, "what brings you to town so early in the season?" "Morning, Helen. Need some things for the lady here." Mrs. Pemberton's gaze shifted to Sarah, taking in the bedraggled wedding dress with sympathy rather than judgment. "Oh, my dear, let's see what we can do for you." What followed was a gentle transformation that Jacob watched with growing fascination. Mrs. Pemberton measured and fitted, selected undergarments and a warm wool cloak, chose sturdy boots and thick stockings. Through it all, Sarah remained almost painfully polite, as if afraid that too much enthusiasm might cause the kindness to evaporate. "The blue dress," Jacob said quietly to Mrs. Pemberton, "and whatever else she needs." When Sarah emerged from the dressing room, Jacob felt something shift in his chest. The blue dress fit perfectly, bringing out the color in her eyes and lending her an air of dignity that the ruined wedding gown had stripped away. She looked like herself again, a woman of substance rather than a figure of pity. "Thank you," she said to Jacob, her voice thick with emotion. I feel human again." They spent the rest of the morning walking through town, Sarah growing more confident with each step in her proper clothing. Jacob found himself pointing out landmarks, sharing bits of local history he'd picked up over the years. It felt natural, this easy companionship, in a way that surprised him. At the barber shop, they encountered Sheriff Tom Bradley, a weathered man in his 50s who'd always treated Jacob fairly, despite his reputation as a hermit. Bradley tipped his hat to Sarah with courteous respect. "Miss Mitchell," he said, "good to see you looking better this morning." "Thank you. Sheriff, Mr. Whitmore has been very kind." Bradley's eyes moved between them, reading something in their interaction that made him nod approvingly. Jacob's good people, even if he does prefer mountains to town folk. "You're in good hands." As they continued their walk, Sarah seemed to gain strength from each positive interaction. Jacob watched her transformation with something approaching wonder. The desperate woman he'd found searching through refuse was revealing herself to be someone entirely different, intelligent, graceful, resilient. They were returning to the inn when a commotion near the bank caught their attention. A well-dressed man in an expensive coat was arguing loudly with someone Jacob couldn't see, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to getting his way. "I don't care what your excuses are," the man was saying. "I made you a fair offer, and I expect an answer." As they drew closer, Jacob could see the man was addressing a young widow named Clara, whose husband had died in a mining accident the previous summer. Clara held her infant son protectively, her face pale with distress. "Mr. Wheeler," she was saying, "I've told you before. I'm not interested in marriage. I'm still mourning my husband, Marcus Wheeler." Jacob recognized the name as belonging to one of the area's wealthier ranchers, stepped closer to Clara in a way that made her shrink back. "Mourning won't put food on your table or keep that baby warm. You need a man's protection." Jacob felt his jaw tighten at Wheeler's tone, but before he could intervene, Sarah stepped forward. "Excuse me," she said politely but firmly. "Clara, is everything all right?" Wheeler turned, his eyes taking in Sarah's appearance with obvious interest. She was beautiful in her new blue dress, and Jacob could see the calculation in the rancher's gaze. "And who might you be?" Wheeler asked, his voice taking on a different quality entirely. "Sarah Mitchell," she replied, moving to stand beside Clara in a gesture of solidarity. "Clara, why don't you come have tea with me at the inn?" Clara looked grateful for the rescue, but Wheeler wasn't finished. "Miss Mitchell," he said as if testing the name, "I don't believe we've met. Are you new to Copper Creek?" "Recently arrived," Sarah answered carefully. Wheeler's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Then perhaps you'd allow me to show you around town. A beautiful woman shouldn't be left to wander alone." Jacob stepped forward then, his presence making Wheeler take a half step back. "The lady's with me," he said quietly. Wheeler's expression hardened as he took in Jacob's buckskins and long hair. "Ah, the mountain man. I should have known." His tone carried clear disdain. "Miss Mitchell, surely you can do better than wilderness trash." The insult hit its mark, but Jacob had heard worse from better men. It was Sarah's sharp intake of breath that concerned him. "Mr. Wheeler," she said, her voice carrying surprising steel, "I'll thank you not to speak of my friends in such terms. And Clara has made her feelings clear. Perhaps you should respect her wishes." Wheeler's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "You'll find this is a small town, Miss Mitchell. People who choose the wrong friends often find themselves unwelcome." With that, he stalked away, leaving the three of them standing in awkward silence. Clara clutched her baby closer, tears of humiliation in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered to Sarah. "I didn't know how to get away from him." "Has he been bothering you long?" Sarah asked gently. "Since my husband died. He says he wants to help, but—" Clara shuddered. "There's something in his eyes that frightens me." Jacob had heard enough about Wheeler over the years to know the man's reputation. Wealthy, influential, and accustomed to getting what he wanted regardless of others' feelings. The kind of man who saw women as possessions to be acquired. "If he bothers you again, you tell Sheriff Bradley," Jacob said. "Or send word to me at the inn." Clara nodded gratefully and hurried away with her child. Sarah watched her go, her expression troubled. "What kind of man threatens a widow with a baby?" she asked. "The kind who thinks money gives him the right to anything he wants," Jacob replied grimly. They walked back to the inn in thoughtful silence, but Jacob could sense something had changed. Sarah's encounter with Wheeler had awakened something in her, a protective instinct, perhaps, or simply the realization that she wasn't the only woman in difficult circumstances. That evening, as they shared another meal by the fireplace, Sarah seemed different, more settled somehow, more present. "I've been thinking," she said as Martha cleared their plates, "about what I might do. To support myself, I mean." Jacob waited for her to continue. "I could teach," she said. "Children, or perhaps young ladies. I had a good education back east and I've read extensively. The town might benefit from a proper school." "That's a fine idea," Jacob agreed, though something in him recoiled at the thought of her staying in Copper Creek permanently. Which was ridiculous. He'd known her less than 24 hours. "Of course, I'd need to find somewhere to live. Somewhere I could afford." She paused, looking into the fire. "Martha mentioned there's a small cabin behind the church that's been empty since the last teacher moved on. It might suit my purposes." Jacob found himself imagining Sarah in her own small home, teaching the town's children, making a life for herself in Copper Creek. It was a good plan, a sensible plan. So why did the thought of leaving her here fill him with such unease? Outside, the first snowflakes began to fall, and Jacob realized that whatever was happening between him and Sarah Mitchell, it was far from over. The storm, brewing beyond the windows, was nothing compared to the one gathering in his own carefully ordered heart. The storm that had threatened all day finally arrived with vengeance, turning the world outside the Golden Creek Inn into a swirling white maze. Jacob stood at his window, watching the snow pile against the building and calculating how many days they might be trapped in town. His packhorse was safely sheltered in the stable, but the trail to his mountain cabin had become impassable. Across the hall, he could hear Sarah moving about her room, the soft sounds of someone trying to occupy herself in a small space. Earlier, she'd asked Martha if there was any mending work she could do to help earn her keep, and now the gentle rhythm of needle and thread provided a counterpoint to the wind's howling. Jacob had spent 15 years learning to read weather patterns, and this storm would last at least 3 days. The thought should have frustrated him. He valued his routines, his solitude, his carefully managed isolation. Instead, he found himself oddly content with the delay. A soft knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. Whitmore?" Sarah's voice was barely audible above the storm. "I'm sorry to bother you, but Martha asked if you'd join us downstairs. She's concerned about the travelers stranded by the weather. Downstairs, Jacob found the inn's common room had become a refuge for half a dozen people caught by the sudden storm. A family of homesteaders huddled near the fireplace, their children wide-eyed at the adventure of being snowed in. Two traveling merchants played cards at a corner table. While an elderly preacher read quietly from a well-worn Bible, Sarah sat with the homesteader's wife, speaking in low, reassuring tones about something Jacob couldn't hear. But he could see the effect of her presence. The woman's rigid posture had relaxed, and she was nodding as Sarah spoke. Whatever comfort Sarah was offering, it was clearly welcome. Martha approached Jacob with a concerned expression. "I've got enough food for a few days, but if this keeps up much longer, we might have to start rationing. You know these mountains better than anyone. How long do you think this will last?" Jacob studied the way the snow was falling, the direction of the wind, the subtle signs that most people missed. 3 days, maybe 4. It's moving fast, but it's got plenty of bite left. Then we'll make do, Martha said, with characteristic determination. At least we've got good company. Over the next few hours, Jacob found himself drawn into the life of the temporary community that had formed in the inn. Sarah seemed to have a natural gift for putting people at ease. She entertained the homesteader children with stories, helped the elderly preacher when his arthritis made turning pages difficult, and even convinced the merchants to teach her their card game, You're Good with People. Jacob observed when they found themselves alone by the fire later that evening. Sarah looked up from the sock she was darning. "My mother always said that kindness costs nothing but means everything. I suppose I learned to pay attention to what others need. That's a rare quality. Is that why you left civilization behind?" she asked gently. "Because you got tired of people not paying attention?" The question caught Jacob off guard with its insight. "Partly," he admitted. "Mostly, I just got tired of caring about people who didn't care back." Sarah set down her needle and thread, giving him her full attention. "What happened?" Jacob had never told anyone the whole story. Not Martha, not Sheriff Bradley, not the few other mountain men he occasionally encountered. But something about Sarah's quiet presence made him want to share the burden he'd carried alone for so long. "Had a wife once," he said quietly, "and a daughter. Little thing, barely walking. We had a farm down in Colorado near Denver. Not much, but it was ours." Sarah waited patiently as Jacob gathered his thoughts. Cholera came through one summer. Took half the settlement, including, his voice caught, including both of them. I buried them in a spot overlooking the valley, with wild flowers all around. Prettiest place you ever saw. "I'm so sorry," Sarah said, and Jacob could hear the genuine sympathy in her voice. "After that, I couldn't stand being around people who kept living their lives like nothing had happened. The world kept turning. Folks kept laughing and planning and hoping. And all I could think was how pointless it all seemed." Jacob pulled his hunting knife from its sheath at his belt, turning the worn handle in his hands. His father had given it to him as a boy, and it had been his constant companion through every hardship since. So I took what I could carry and headed for the mountains. Figured I'd either learn to live alone or die trying. Turns out I was tougher than I thought. Sarah reached across the space between them and briefly touched his hand. "You survived because you were meant to, maybe not just for yourself." The contact was brief, barely a heartbeat, but it sent something warm through Jacob's chest that had nothing to do with the fire crackling nearby. "What about you?" he asked. "What made you brave enough to answer a stranger's marriage proposal and travel halfway across the country?" Sarah's smile was rueful, desperation mostly. "After my parents died, I tried to make it on my own back in Philadelphia. But work for women is hard to come by, especially work that pays enough to live on. I was teaching piano lessons to wealthy children for barely enough to pay for a tiny room in a boarding house." She picked up her needle again, her hands needing something to do while she talked. "When Thomas's letter arrived, it seemed like Providence. He wrote such beautiful things about Montana, about building a life together, about wanting a partner rather than just a wife. He promised to love and protect me, to give me a home where I could be useful and valued. But he was lying." "Not entirely," Sarah said thoughtfully. I think he meant it when he wrote those letters. But when faced with the reality of marriage to a stranger, he lost his nerve. Or maybe he just decided the money was more valuable than the wife. Jacob watched her fingers move skillfully with the needle and thread, mending a tear in one of Martha's table linens. Even this simple domestic task she performed with grace and attention to detail. "You know how to take care of things," he observed. "Mending, cooking, managing a household. Those are valuable skills out here. My mother taught me well. She always said a woman should be able to stand on her own, husband or no husband." Sarah's voice carried pride, mixed with sadness. "I just never expected to have to prove it quite so dramatically." The storm continued to rage outside, but the warmth of the common room made their small world feel safe and separate from the chaos beyond the windows. Jacob found himself studying Sarah's face in the firelight, noting the determined set of her jaw, the intelligent spark in her dark eyes, the way she moved with unconscious elegance despite everything she'd been through. "Tell me about your mountain cabin," she said suddenly. "What's it like to live so far from everything?" Jacob leaned back in his chair, surprised by how much he wanted to share that part of his life with her. "Peaceful, mostly. I built it myself, in a valley about 40 miles north of here. Got a good water source, timber for fuel, plenty of game for food. In summer, the meadows are full of wildflowers, and you can see for miles in every direction. It sounds beautiful." It is. Sunrise hits the peaks just so, turns everything gold for a few minutes each morning. And the quiet, you never realize how much noise civilization makes until you live without it. Sarah was quiet for a moment, as if imagining such a life. "Don't you ever get lonely?" "Loneliness and being alone aren't the same thing," Jacob said. "I was lonelier in that farmhouse after my family died than I've ever been in the mountains, but surely you must miss having someone to share things with." The sunrise is the beauty of the place. Jacob considered this. Until a few days ago, he would have said no without hesitation. Now, watching Sarah's face as she listened to his descriptions, he found himself imagining what it might be like to show her those mountain meadows, to see his familiar world through her fresh eyes. "Maybe," he admitted. "But sharing means risking loss, and I'm not sure I'm strong enough to survive that again." Sarah set down her mending and looked directly at him. "Mr. Whitmore, Jacob, may I speak plainly?" He nodded. "I think you're stronger than you know. You've built a life from nothing, survived on your own for 15 years, and yet when you saw a stranger in need, you didn't hesitate to help. That's not the action of a man who's given up on caring." "Maybe I just had a moment of weakness," Sarah smiled. "Then I'm grateful for your weakness. Without it, I'd probably be dead by now." The starkness of her words hit Jacob harder than he expected. She was right. Another day without food, another night in the cold, and the woman sitting across from him might not have survived. The thought filled him with an anger so fierce it surprised him. "Men like that Thomas fellow," he said grimly, "they ought to be horsewhipped." "Perhaps. But if he hadn't abandoned me, I never would have met you. And despite everything, I'm beginning to think that might be the most fortunate thing that's ever happened to me." Their eyes met across the small space between their chairs, and Jacob felt something pass between them, an understanding, perhaps, or simply the recognition of two souls who had found unexpected solace in each other's company. The moment was interrupted by one of the homesteader children, a little girl who approached Sarah shyly. "Miss Sarah," she whispered, "Mama says, could you tell us another story before bed?" Sarah's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "Of course, sweetie. What kind of story would you like?" As Sarah gathered the children around her chair and began spinning a tale about brave pioneers and magical snowstorms, Jacob watched from his place by the fire. She was a natural storyteller, varying her voice for different characters, making the children gasp and giggle at appropriate moments. But what struck him most was the transformation in her own face as she spoke. Gone was the haunted look of desperate survival, replaced by joy and purpose. This was who Sarah Mitchell really was, beneath the tragedy that had brought her to Copper Creek. A woman who found meaning in caring for others, who possessed an innate gift for bringing comfort and happiness to those around her. For the first time in 15 years, Jacob found himself wondering what it might be like to build a life with someone again. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, as he watched Sarah tuck the sleepy children in beside their parents and wish everyone a peaceful night, all he felt was a deep sense of possibility opening up in his chest like spring water breaking through winter ice. The third morning of the storm dawned grey and still. The fury of the previous days finally spent. Jacob woke to the sound of snow sliding from the inn's roof and the distant voices of children playing in the drifts that had piled against the buildings. From his window, he could see the world transformed into something clean and white, beautiful in its harsh simplicity. He dressed and made his way downstairs, where he found Sarah already in the kitchen, helping Martha prepare breakfast for their extended household of stranded travelers. She wore a simple apron over her blue dress and moved around the cramped space with easy competence, cracking eggs into a large bowl while Martha tended the stove. "Morning," Jacob said, accepting the cup of coffee Martha handed him. "Good morning," Sarah replied, her smile warming him more than the hot drink. "Martha's been teaching me her secret for fluffy biscuits. Apparently I've been overworking the dough. The girl's got good hands for cooking," Martha observed approvingly. "Patient hands. That's half the battle." Jacob watched Sarah work, noting the careful way she measured flour, the gentle touch she used with the delicate dough. Everything she did carried that same quality of thoughtful attention he'd noticed when she was mending clothes or telling stories to the children. After breakfast, as the stranded travelers began to venture outside to assess the storm's aftermath, Jacob found Sarah standing in the inn's small parlor, staring out at the snow-covered town. She was holding something in her hands, a small locket that caught the morning light. "That's pretty," Jacob said, approaching quietly so as not to startle her. Sarah looked up, her expression wistful. "It was my mother's, the only thing of real value I have left." She opened the delicate gold case to reveal two tiny photographs, a stern-looking man with kind eyes, and a woman whose features clearly echoed in Sarah's own face. "They looked like good people," Jacob observed. They were. Papai was a school principal, and Mama taught music lessons from our home. They believed in education, in treating everyone with dignity, in the power of kindness to change the world. Sarah's thumb traced the edge of the locket. "I sometimes wonder what they would think of where I've ended up." "I think," Jacob said carefully, "they'd be proud of how you've handled yourself. It takes strength to keep your dignity when everything falls apart." Sarah closed the locket and slipped it back into her dress pocket. "Some days I feel strong. Other days I feel like I'm barely holding myself together." "That's what courage looks like," Jacob said. "Not the absence of fear, but moving forward despite it." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the town slowly come back to life. Children had appeared with sleds, their laughter echoing off the buildings as they made the most of the deep snow. Shopkeepers were shoveling paths to their doors, and the sound of horses and wagons resumed as the main street became passable again. "The trail to your cabin will be clear soon," Sarah said, and Jacob heard something in her voice that might have been regret. "Probably by this afternoon," he agreed, though the prospect of leaving now filled him with unexpected reluctance. "You must be eager to get back to your mountain, and to your peaceful life." Jacob studied her profile, the way the morning light brought out the subtle gold in her dark hair. "I thought I would be," he admitted, "but I find myself in no particular hurry." Sarah turned to look at him directly. "Why?" It was a simple question that demanded an honest answer. Jacob had been asking himself the same thing for 3 days, ever since he'd first decided to help a desperate woman searching for food in the snow. "Because," he said slowly, "for the first time in 15 years, I'm not thinking about the past or worrying about the future. I'm just here, present, and that's something I'd forgotten how to be." Understanding flickered in Sarah's eyes. "I know exactly what you mean. These past few days, taking care of the children, helping Martha, talking with you, it's the first time since my parents died that I've felt useful, like I have something to offer the world." "You have a great deal to offer," Jacob said with conviction. "Anyone who spends 5 minutes with you can see that." A blush colored Sarah's cheeks, and she looked away. You're very kind to say so. I'm not being kind. I'm being truthful. Before Sarah could respond, Martha appeared in the doorway. Jacob, there's someone here to see you. That Wheeler fellow. Jacob felt his jaw tighten at the name. Through the front window, he could see Marcus Wheeler standing beside an expensive sleigh, his breath forming white clouds as he spoke to his driver. The man was dressed in a fine wool coat and fur hat, every inch the prosperous rancher. What does he want? Jacob asked. Didn't say, but he's been asking questions about Miss Sarah around town. Wanted to know how long she was planning to stay, where she came from, things like that. Sarah's face paled. Why would he be asking about me? Jacob's protective instincts flared immediately. I'll find out. He stepped outside into the crisp morning air, his boots crunching through the snow as he approached Wheeler. The rancher's smile was genial enough, but Jacob had learned to read men's eyes, and Wheeler's held calculation rather than warmth. Whitmore, Wheeler said with false heartiness. Heard you got caught by the storm. Hope you weren't too inconvenienced. I've weathered worse, Jacob replied evenly. What can I do for you? Wheeler glanced toward the inn, where Sarah was visible through the window. Actually, I wanted to discuss that young woman you've been escorting around town. Miss Mitchell, is it? What about her? Well, as one of the more established members of this community, I feel a certain responsibility for newcomers, especially attractive young ladies who might be, shall we say, vulnerable to the wrong influences. Jacob kept his expression neutral, despite the insult. Meaning that a woman in her circumstances might benefit from the protection and guidance of someone with more to offer than a mountain hermit. Someone who could provide her with security, a proper home, a place in respectable society. She seems to be managing just fine on her own. Wheeler's smile became more predatory. For now, perhaps. But winter's long, and charity has its limits. What happens when the good people of Copper Creek grow tired of supporting a woman with no family, no money, no prospects? What happens when you disappear back to your mountain and she's left to fend for herself? The questions hit their mark because Jacob had been wondering the same things. But hearing them from Wheeler's mouth made them sound like threats rather than concerns. That's her decision to make, Jacob said. Of course. I'm merely suggesting that she might benefit from knowing all her options. I've spoken to several people in town, and the consensus is that Miss Mitchell is a refined, educated woman who deserves better than— His gesture took in Jacob's buckskins and weathered appearance. Well, better than temporary charity. Jacob felt anger building in his chest, but he kept his voice level. You got something specific to say, Wheeler? I'm prepared to offer Miss Mitchell my protection as my wife. She'd want for nothing, a fine house, servants, a position of respect in the community. All she'd have to do is accept my proposal. And if she's not interested— Wheeler's expression hardened slightly. Then she'd be making a very poor choice. As I said, charity has its limits, and this town has ways of encouraging people to make sensible decisions. The threat was clear enough, though carefully wrapped in civilized language. Jacob studied Wheeler's face, reading the arrogance and entitlement that money and power had bred in him. I'll be sure to pass along your generous offer, Jacob said dryly. See that you do. And Whitmore, a word of advice. Men like you are tolerated here because you keep to yourselves and don't cause trouble. It would be unfortunate if that understanding changed. With that, Wheeler climbed back into his sleigh and drove away, leaving Jacob standing in the snow with anger burning cold in his chest. Inside the inn, Sarah was waiting anxiously. What did he want? Jacob hesitated, not wanting to frighten her, but knowing she needed to understand what she was facing. He wants to marry you. Sarah's face went white. What? Made it sound like he was doing you a favor, offering protection and security in exchange for becoming his wife. And if I refuse? Jacob met her eyes directly. He made it pretty clear that life in Copper Creek might become difficult for you. Sarah sank into a chair, her hands trembling. So I'm to choose between marrying a man who frightens me or becoming an outcast with nowhere to go? No, Jacob said firmly. You're to choose what's right for you, and anyone who has a problem with that choice can answer to me. Sarah looked up at him, hope and fear warring in her expression. "You can't fight the whole town for me, Jacob, and you can't stay here forever." She was right, and they both knew it. Jacob's life was in the mountains, not in this small frontier town with its complicated social dynamics and ambitious men like Wheeler. But as he looked at Sarah's pale face, at the way she was trying so hard to be brave despite everything, he found himself making a decision that would have seemed impossible a week ago. "There is another option," he said quietly. "What?" Jacob took a deep breath, knowing that what he was about to say would change everything between them. "You could come with me." "To the mountain." Sarah stared at him as if she hadn't heard correctly. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that if you want to learn to live independently, to be beholden to no one, I could teach you. My cabin's big enough for two, and the mountain doesn't care about your past or your circumstances. It only cares whether you're strong enough to survive." "Jacob, I couldn't possibly. It wouldn't be proper." "Proper's what got you into this mess," Jacob pointed out. "Following the rules, trusting in promises, believing that other people would take care of you. Maybe it's time to stop worrying about proper and start thinking about possible." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, and Jacob could almost see her mind working through the implications of what he was suggesting. "You barely know me," she said finally. "What if I can't handle mountain life? What if I'm more burden than help? What if you're stronger than you think?" Jacob countered. "What if all you need is someone to believe in you long enough for you to believe in yourself?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. "And what do you get out of this arrangement?" Jacob considered the question seriously. Company, purpose, a reason to care about something beyond just surviving another day. That's all. Jacob met her gaze steadily. "For now, that's enough." Sarah stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the snow-covered mountains in the distance. Jacob could see her weighing options, calculating risks, trying to imagine a future that was completely different from anything she'd ever known. "If I said yes," she said slowly, "what would that mean exactly?" "It would mean learning to hunt and fish, to preserve food for winter, to read weather signs and animal tracks. It would mean hard work, simple pleasures, and depending on yourself instead of others. And between us, what would the expectations be?" Jacob appreciated her directness. "Whatever we both agreed to. I'm not Wheeler, Sarah. I don't believe in forcing my will on others, especially women who've already been hurt by men who thought they knew what was best." Sarah turned to face him. "You'd really do this?" "Take responsibility for someone you've known less than a week." "I'd offer you the chance to take responsibility for yourself." "There's a difference." For a moment, Jacob thought she might actually consider it. Then reality seemed to reassert itself, and she shook her head. "It's an incredibly generous offer, Jacob, but I couldn't accept it. It wouldn't be fair to you." "Why not?" "Because you saved my life once already. I can't let you sacrifice your peace and solitude to save it again." Jacob stepped closer, his voice gentle but firm. "What if I told you that helping you hasn't felt like a sacrifice? What if I said that these past few days have been the most alive I've felt in 15 years? Sarah's breath caught. "Jacob, I'm not asking you to marry me, Sarah. I'm not asking for promises or commitments or anything beyond a willingness to try something different. All I'm asking is that you consider the possibility that maybe we could help each other." Before Sarah could respond, Martha appeared in the doorway again, this time with Sheriff Bradley behind her. "Sorry to interrupt," Bradley said, "but I need to speak with Miss Mitchell. There's been some concerning talk around town." Jacob felt his stomach tighten. "What kind of talk?" "The kind that suggests certain influential people are questioning Miss Mitchell's character and her right to remain in Copper Creek." Bradley's expression was sympathetic, but serious. "I'm not saying I agree with it, but I am saying that things might get uncomfortable for her if she stays." Sarah's face crumpled. "So I'm to be driven out like some kind of criminal?" "Not if I can help it," Bradley said firmly. "But I wanted you to know what you're facing." Jacob looked between Sarah and the sheriff, his decision crystallizing. "She won't be staying in Copper Creek." Both Sarah and Bradley looked at him in surprise. "She'll be coming with me," Jacob continued, "if she wants to." Sarah stared at him, and Jacob could see her weighing her limited options. Stay and face Wheeler's pressure and the town's judgment, or take a leap of faith with a man who offered her something no one else had, the chance to determine her own fate. "I need time to think," she said finally. "Of course," Jacob said, "but not too much time." The trail conditions won't hold forever. As Sheriff Bradley left and Martha discreetly withdrew, Jacob and Sarah found themselves alone again. The weight of the decision hung between them, heavy with possibility and uncertainty. "Tell me honestly," Sarah said quietly. "If I come with you, what are the chances that I'll survive the winter?" Jacob considered the question seriously. "If you're willing to learn and work hard?" "Good. Mountain life isn't easy, but it's not impossible. People have been doing it for generations, and the chances that we'll both regret this decision—" "I don't know," Jacob admitted, "but I know I'll regret not asking. And I think you might regret not trying." Sarah nodded slowly. "Then give me until tonight to decide." "Fair enough." As Jacob left her to her thoughts and went to check on his horse and supplies, he found himself hoping for an answer he hadn't expected to want. The prospect of returning to his mountain cabin alone, after these few days of companionship and purpose, felt more daunting than the idea of sharing his carefully ordered life with someone else. For the first time since he'd lost his family, Jacob Whitmore was allowing himself to hope for a future that included another person. It was terrifying and exhilarating and completely unlike anything he'd imagined when he'd ridden into Copper Creek seeking nothing more than winter supplies. Whether Sarah would choose to share that future remained to be seen. But either way, Jacob knew that something fundamental had shifted in him. He was no longer content to simply survive. He wanted to live again. Sarah stood at her window that evening, watching shadows lengthen across the snow-covered town as she wrestled with the most important decision of her life. Below in the street, normal life had resumed. People walking to evening services at the church, children being called in for supper. The warm glow of lanterns beginning to appear in windows. It looked peaceful, civilized, safe. Everything she thought she'd wanted when she'd answered Thomas Garrett's marriage proposal. But she'd learned that safety could be an illusion, and civilization could turn cruel when powerful men decided a woman didn't belong. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting Martha with evening tea. Instead, Jacob entered, carrying a leather portfolio she hadn't seen before. "Sorry to disturb you. Thought you might like to see something that could help with your decision." He handed her the portfolio, and Sarah opened it to find an official-looking document with neat handwriting and an official seal. "What is this?" "Deed to my property," Jacob said simply. 40 acres in Paradise Valley, including the cabin, outbuildings, and mineral rights. Bought it legal from the territorial government 10 years ago. Sarah studied the document, noting Jacob's full name written in formal script, Jacob Thomas Whitmore. Somehow seeing his middle name, the same as her faithless fiancé, made him seem more real, more human. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because I want you to understand that what I'm offering isn't some temporary arrangement. That land is my home, bought and paid for. If you come with me, you'd have legal protections, not just my word." Sarah looked up from the deed to study Jacob's face. "Legal protections? I'd add your name to the deed as joint owner. That way, if something happened to me, you'd have clear title to the property. You'd never be dependent on anyone's charity again." The generosity of the offer took Sarah's breath away. "Jacob, you can't possibly mean that." "You barely know me. I know enough," he said firmly. "I know you're kind to children and respectful to your elders. I know you work hard and don't complain when life gets difficult. I know you're brave enough to start over when everything falls apart. That's more than most people reveal about themselves in a lifetime." Sarah set the deed carefully on her small table and walked to the window again. In the distance, she could see the outline of mountains against the darkening sky. Jacob's mountains, wild and unforgiving, but somehow promising freedom. "What's it really like up there?" she asked. "Your daily life, I mean." Jacob joined her at the window. Quiet, purposeful, I get up with the sun, check my snares and fishing lines, tend to whatever needs doing around the cabin. In winter, there's wood to cut and stack, tools to mend, books to read by the fire. In summer, there's a garden to tend, meat to smoke, berries to gather and preserve. It sounds lonely. It was. Until a few days ago, I thought that was what I wanted. Sarah glanced at him sideways. What changed? Jacob was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. You did. Watching you with the children, the way you helped Martha, how you stood up to Wheeler when he was bothering Clara, it reminded me that there's more to living than just surviving. But what if I disappoint you? What if I can't adapt to mountain life? What if— Jacob turned to face her fully. Sarah, what if the sun doesn't rise tomorrow? What if the mountains crumble into dust? You can't live your life on what-ifs. Easy for you to say. You're not the one being asked to give up everything familiar, aren't I? Jacob's voice was gentle but pointed. I'm asking you to share the place that's been my refuge for 15 years. I'm offering to teach you skills I've never taught anyone else. I'm putting my solitude, my peace, my carefully ordered life at risk because I believe you're worth it. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes at his words. Why me? Because when I look at you, I see possibility. I see strength that hasn't been tested yet, intelligence that hasn't been valued, courage that's been beaten down but not broken. You remind me of who I used to be before I gave up on hoping for anything better. Before Sarah could respond, voices from the street below drew their attention. Through the window, they could see Marcus Wheeler talking animatedly with two other men outside the saloon. Even from this distance, his gestures seemed aggressive, his tone carrying clearly in the cold air. Won't have some mountain savage corrupting decent women in this town, Wheeler was saying. There are standards to maintain. One of his companions, a man Sarah recognized as the banker, nodded agreement. Something should be done before this gets out of hand. Jacob's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. Looks like Wheeler's building support for his position. What does that mean for you, for us? It means the decision's getting made for us, one way or another. Sarah watched Wheeler gesture toward the inn, clearly discussing her situation with growing animation. The sight filled her with a familiar dread, the helpless feeling of being talked about, judged, having her fate decided by men who saw her as a problem to be solved rather than a person with her own agency. I won't be driven out like some kind of criminal, she said suddenly, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. Jacob looked at her with something that might have been pride. No, you won't, and I won't marry Marcus Wheeler just to make things convenient for everyone else. Good. Sarah took a deep breath, feeling something shift inside her, a resolve she hadn't known she possessed. Then I guess I'm going to the mountains. Jacob went very still. Are you sure? No, Sarah admitted. I'm terrified. But I'm more terrified of staying here and becoming the kind of woman who lets other people decide her life for her. It won't be easy. Nothing worthwhile ever is. Jacob extended his hand to her, and Sarah took it without hesitation. His grip was warm and steady, calloused from years of hard work, but gentle in its strength. Partners, he asked. Partners, Sarah agreed. The next morning dawned clear and cold, perfect for mountain travel. Sarah packed her few belongings in a canvas bag Jacob had provided, marveling at how little she actually owned. The blue dress, some undergarments, her mother's locket, and the wedding ring she now wore on her right hand. Everything she had left of her former life fit easily in one small bag. Martha helped her prepare for the journey, providing warm wool stockings and a thick coat that had belonged to her late husband. It'll be too big, Martha said, helping Sarah into the garment, but it'll keep you warm. That's what matters. Thank you for everything, Sarah said, embracing the older woman. You saved my life as much as Jacob did. Nonsense. You saved yourself by having the courage to accept help when it was offered. That's harder than most people realize. Downstairs, Jacob was loading supplies onto his pack horse, extra blankets, additional food stores, and various items Sarah didn't recognize, but assumed were necessary for mountain living. He moved with efficient purpose, every motion economical and practiced. Sheriff Bradley appeared as they were making final preparations. Heard you two were heading out, he said. Probably for the best, given the mood in town. Things that bad? Jacob asked, getting there. Wheeler's been talking to anyone who'll listen about protecting the town's moral standards. Some folks are buying it. Sarah felt a flash of anger at the injustice. What about Clara? Is she safe? Bradley nodded. Clara's got family in Denver, leaving on this morning's stage with her baby. Wheeler's interest will have to find a new target. Good for her, Sarah said with genuine relief. As they prepared to leave, a small crowd gathered to watch their departure. Most faces were neutral, but Sarah could see disapproval in some expressions, curiosity in others. A few people, including Martha and the Homesteader family from the inn, offered genuine well wishes. Jacob helped Sarah mount the gentle mare he'd purchased for her journey, his hands steady and reassuring as he checked the stirrups and reins. "Remember what I taught you yesterday," he said quietly. "Sit deep, keep your hands soft, let her do most of the work." "I remember." As they rode out of Copper Creek, Sarah turned for one last look at the town that had offered her both salvation and judgment. The mountains ahead looked impossibly vast and wild, but they also looked free. No Marcus Wheelers, no social expectations, no one to judge her choices except herself. "Scared?" Jacob asked as they reached the edge of town. "Terrified," Sarah admitted, "but also excited." "Is that strange?" "No," Jacob said with a smile. "That sounds about right." The trail to Jacob's mountain cabin wound upward through pine forests and across frozen meadows, the silence broken only by the creak of leather and the soft sound of hooves in snow. Sarah found herself relaxing into the rhythm of travel, her initial nervousness giving way to wonder at the pristine beauty surrounding them. "It's magnificent," she breathed, gazing up at peaks that seemed to touch the sky. "Wait until you see the valley," Jacob said. "It's something special." As they climbed higher, Jacob pointed out landmarks and shared knowledge that would be essential for mountain survival. How to read animal tracks in snow, which plants were edible, how to predict weather changes by watching cloud formations. Sarah listened intently, understanding that her life might depend on remembering these lessons. "The key to mountain living," Jacob explained as they paused to rest the horses, "is preparation. You think ahead, plan for problems before they happen, and never take unnecessary risks. The mountains don't forgive mistakes." "Sounds like good advice for life in general," Sarah observed. "It is. Too bad it took me so long to learn it." By afternoon, they reached a ridge that overlooked Jacob's Valley. Sarah gasped at the sight. A perfect bowl of snow-covered meadows surrounded by towering peaks, with a small cabin nestled among pine trees near a frozen stream. Smoke rose from the chimney, and Sarah realized Jacob must have arranged for someone to maintain the fire while he was gone. "Welcome home," Jacob said simply. Sarah stared at the scene below, overwhelmed by its beauty and the reality of what she'd chosen. This would be her life now, this wild, isolated place where she'd have to learn entirely new ways of being. "Jacob," she said quietly, "I want you to know that whatever happens, I'm grateful. For the rescue, for the choice, for believing I was worth saving." "You are worth saving," he replied. "Now let's get down there before we lose the light. You've got a lot to learn, and winter's the best teacher there is." As they began their descent into Paradise Valley, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since her parents died, a sense of coming home to a place where she belonged. It might be frightening and uncertain, but it was hers to make of what she could. For the first time in months, Sarah Mitchell was truly free. The cabin was larger than Sarah had expected, built from solid pine logs and chinked with careful precision. Inside, she found a single large room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen area with a cast-iron stove, and sleeping quarters separated by hanging blankets. Everything was practical but well-made, speaking of a man who took pride in his craftsmanship. "It's wonderful," Sarah said, running her hand along the smooth surface of a handmade table. "You built all of this yourself?" "Took 3 summers to get it right," Jacob replied, stirring the fire back to life. "Had to haul most of the materials up here by pack train. Worth every backache, though." Over the next few days, Sarah began to understand the rhythm of mountain life. Jacob woke before dawn to check his trap lines and tend to the animals. 2 horses, a milk cow, and a small flock of chickens that somehow managed to thrive despite the harsh conditions. Sarah learned to milk the cow, gather eggs, and help with the endless task of keeping the fire burning. "Fire is life up here," Jacob explained, as he showed her how to bank the coals properly. "Let it die, and you might not live to regret it." Sarah proved to be a quick learner, approaching each new skill with the same methodical attention she'd once applied to piano lessons and literature studies. Jacob found himself impressed by her adaptability and her willingness to tackle tasks that would have daunted many people. "You're a natural," he observed one morning as she expertly prepared cornbread for breakfast. "Most folks take months to get comfortable with wood stove cooking." "I had a good teacher," Sarah replied. But Jacob could see the quiet pride in her accomplishment. In the evenings, they sat by the fire reading. Jacob had an impressive collection of books for a mountain hermit, everything from practical manuals to poetry collections. Sarah was delighted to discover volumes she hadn't seen in years, and their discussions ranged from literature to philosophy to the practical realities of frontier life. "I never expected to find Emerson in a mountain cabin," Sarah laughed one night, holding up a well-worn copy of Self-Reliance. "Man's got to feed his mind as well as his body," Jacob replied. "Besides, Emerson understood something about independence that most folks miss. It's not about rejecting everything, it's about choosing what's worthy of your commitment." As the days passed, Sarah began working on a project that had been growing in her mind since their first night in the cabin. Using fabric scraps she'd found in Jacob's supply chest and skills her mother had taught her, she was creating a quilt, not the kind of elaborate showpiece wealthy ladies made for display, but a practical, warm covering designed for mountain winters. The work soothed her in ways she hadn't expected. Each carefully placed stitch represented stability, permanence, a future worth planning for. The pattern she'd chosen was simple but elegant, interlocking rings that seemed to expand infinitely across the fabric. "That's coming along nicely," Jacob commented one evening, watching her work by lamplight. "It's therapeutic," Sarah admitted. "Something about the repetition, the way each piece connects to the next. It makes me feel like I'm building something that will last." Jacob nodded, understanding. "That's how I felt when I was building this cabin. Every log fitted into place, every joint crafted to hold against wind and weather, creating something permanent in a world that changes so fast." Their conversation was interrupted by an unusual sound from outside, the whinny of horses that didn't belong to them. Jacob immediately went to the window, his hand moving instinctively to the rifle hanging above the fireplace. "Someone's coming up the trail," he said quietly. 3 riders moving fast. Sarah set aside her quilting, anxiety knotting her stomach. Who would be traveling in this weather? "No one with good intentions," Jacob replied grimly. "Get your coat and boots on. If I tell you to run, head for the root cellar behind the cabin and stay hidden until I come for you." Sarah's hands shook as she pulled on her boots, but she forced herself to move calmly. Through the window, she could see torches approaching through the trees, their light dancing eerily against the snow. Jacob opened the door before the riders could knock, his rifle held casually but ready. Sarah recognized the lead horseman immediately, Marcus Wheeler, his face flushed with cold, and something that might have been anger. "Wheeler," Jacob said evenly. "You're a long way from your ranch." Not far enough, apparently. Wheeler dismounted, followed by 2 men Sarah didn't recognize, hard-faced individuals who had the look of hired help rather than respectable ranchers. "What brings you to my valley?" Wheeler stepped into the circle of light cast by the cabin's windows, his expensive coat and boots marking him as out of place in the wilderness setting. "I think you know why I'm here, Whitmore. I've come for Miss Mitchell. Have you?" Jacob's tone remained conversational, but Sarah could see tension in his shoulders. "That's interesting, considering she's free to make her own choices, not when those choices involve corrupting the moral standards of decent communities." Wheeler's gaze moved past Jacob to where Sarah stood in the doorway. "Miss Mitchell, I'm prepared to overlook this unfortunate episode if you'll come with me now." I have a preacher waiting in town, and we can be married before this scandal spreads any further." Sarah stepped forward, drawing strength from the solid presence of the cabin behind her and Jacob beside her. "Mr. Wheeler, I've already given you my answer. I'm not interested in your proposal. You don't understand the position you're in," Wheeler said, his voice taking on an edge of frustration. "Living up here unmarried with a man of questionable reputation, it's not just improper, it's dangerous. People in Copper Creek are talking. Let them talk," Sarah replied with more courage than she felt. Wheeler's expression hardened. "I'm afraid it's gone beyond talk. The territorial marshal has been informed about the situation. Questions are being raised about Whitmore's past, his right to be here, his intentions toward respectable women." Jacob went very still. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that might require official investigation. Unless, of course, Miss Mitchell removes herself from this compromising situation before things go too far." The threat hung in the cold air between them, and Sarah realized that Wheeler had found a way to use the law itself as a weapon against them. In a territory where women had few rights and men like Wheeler held influence, accusations alone could be devastating. "You're threatening to have Jacob arrested on false charges," she said, her voice shaking with anger rather than fear. "I'm offering to prevent a regrettable situation from escalating," Wheeler corrected smoothly. "All it requires is your cooperation." Sarah looked at Jacob, seeing the tension in his face as he calculated their options. She knew he was thinking about running. It would be easy enough to disappear into the mountains, start over somewhere else. But running would mean giving up everything he'd built here, everything they'd begun to build together. "No," she said suddenly, surprising everyone, including herself. "I beg your pardon?" Wheeler's eyebrows rose. "I said no. I won't be threatened or manipulated into marrying you. I won't let you destroy Jacob's life with lies. And I won't reward your bullying by giving you what you want." Wheeler's face flushed with anger. "You're making a serious mistake, Miss Mitchell. I have influence in this territory. I can make life very difficult for both of you. Then I guess we'll have to be stronger than your influence," Sarah replied, moving to stand closer to Jacob. Jacob placed a protective hand on her shoulder, his presence steady and reassuring. "You heard the lady, Wheeler. Time for you and your friends to leave." For a moment, Wheeler looked as if he might argue further. Then his gaze moved to the rifle in Jacob's hands and the determined expression on Sarah's face, and he seemed to realize that threats alone wouldn't accomplish his goals. "This isn't over," he said, remounting his horse. "You're making enemies you can't afford. Both of you." As the riders disappeared back down the mountain trail, Jacob and Sarah stood in the doorway watching their torches fade into the darkness. "Are you sure about this?" Jacob asked quietly. He wasn't bluffing about making trouble. Life could get complicated. Sarah turned to look at him, seeing the man who had rescued her not just from starvation, but from a life of dependence and fear. In the lamplight, his weathered face showed concern for her welfare rather than his own, just as it had from the moment they met. "I'm sure," she said firmly. "Whatever comes, we'll face it together." Jacob nodded, his expression resolving into something that looked like determination mixed with anticipation. "Then we'd better prepare for whatever Wheeler has planned. Because a man like that doesn't give up easily." As they secured the cabin for the night, Sarah found herself thinking about the quilt she'd been working on, those interlocking rings that grew stronger when joined together. Perhaps that was what she and Jacob were building here in this mountain valley. Not just individual survival, but something larger and more resilient than either of them could create alone. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the pines with a sound like distant voices. But inside the cabin, warmed by fire and sustained by a connection neither of them had expected to find, Sarah felt safer than she had in years. Whatever Marcus Wheeler brought against them, they would meet it as partners. And that, she was beginning to understand, made all the difference in the world. 3 days after Wheeler's visit, Sarah was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin when she heard horses approaching again. This time, however, the riders announced themselves with a shout before coming into view. "Hello, the cabin! Sheriff Bradley coming up." Jacob emerged from the woodshed, his expression wary but not hostile. Sheriff Bradley rode up the trail alone, but his posture suggested official business rather than a friendly visit. "Tom," Jacob greeted him. "What brings you all the way up here?" Bradley dismounted, his face grave. "I wish it was a social call, Jacob, but I'm afraid it's not." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper. "Got a warrant here I need to serve." Sarah felt her heart sink as she approached the two men. "A warrant for what?" "For Jacob's arrest," Bradley said reluctantly. "Charges of kidnapping and corrupting the morals of a minor. That's ridiculous." Sarah exploded. "I'm 25 years old, and I came here of my own free will." Bradley held up a hand. "Miss Mitchell, I know how this looks, and I'm not saying I believe the charges. But they've been properly filed, and I have to follow the law." Jacob's face had gone carefully neutral, the expression of a man who'd faced trouble before. "Who filed them?" "Marcus Wheeler. Claims you abducted Miss Mitchell against her will and are holding her here for immoral purposes." Sarah felt rage building in her chest. "Sheriff Bradley, you know that's not true. You were there when we decided to leave Copper Creek together." "I know what I saw," Bradley agreed. "But Wheeler's got witnesses who say different. Claims you were coerced, threatened into leaving with Jacob." "What witnesses?" Jacob demanded. Bradley consulted the warrant. "Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell and her daughter Agnes. They claim they overheard Jacob threatening you at the inn." Sarah frowned, trying to remember. Then recognition dawned. "The Hartwells. They were staying at the inn during the storm. I barely spoke to them. They say they heard Jacob tell you that you'd regret not accepting his protection, that terrible things would happen to women alone in frontier towns." Sarah stared at Bradley in disbelief. "He did say something like that, but it wasn't a threat. He was warning me about Wheeler. He was trying to help me understand my options." "I believe you," Bradley said gently. "But the territorial judge doesn't know you like I do. And Wheeler's got influence." Jacob was studying the warrant with the focused attention of someone reading his own death sentence. "What else does it say?" "There's more," Bradley admitted reluctantly. "Wheeler's been doing some research into your background. Claims you're not who you say you are." Sarah looked between the two men, sensing undercurrents she didn't understand. "What does that mean?" Bradley met Jacob's eyes directly. "Means someone's been talking to folks down in Colorado about a man named Jake Thornton who robbed a bank in Denver 15 years ago." The world seemed to tilt around Sarah. She looked at Jacob, really looked at him, and saw something in his expression that confirmed her worst fear. Not denial or outrage at false accusations, but the weary resignation of a man whose past had finally caught up with him. "Jacob," she whispered. Jacob was quiet for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "Jake Thornton was the name I used back then. Before I became Jacob Whitmore, before I learned better." Sarah felt as if the ground was shifting beneath her feet. Everything she thought she knew about Jacob, about their situation, about her own judgment, suddenly seemed questionable. "You robbed a bank?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Tried to. Made a mess of it, truth be told. Got away with about $50 and a guilty conscience that's haunted me for 15 years. Bradley stepped closer, his hand moving to his gun belt. "Jacob, you know I have to take you in." "I know," Jacob said quietly. Then to Sarah, "There's more you should know. The reason I went up to the mountains wasn't just grief over losing my family. I was running from what I'd done, from who I'd been." Sarah stared at him, trying to reconcile the gentle, honorable man she'd come to care for with the image of a bank robber fleeing justice. "Why?" she asked. "Why did you do it?" Jacob's expression was filled with pain and old regret. "After my wife and daughter died, I lost everything. The farm, the livestock, everything we'd built together. Creditors took it all to pay debts I couldn't handle alone. I was angry, desperate, half crazy with grief. Thought I deserved to take back what life had stolen from me. But you didn't go through with it?" "Oh, I went through with it," Jacob said bitterly. "Walked into that bank with a gun and a heart full of rage. Demanded money that wasn't mine. But when I saw the teller, a young woman about my wife's age, scared half to death, I realized what I'd become, what I was doing to someone else's life." Sarah's mind reeled as she tried to process this revelation. The man who had rescued her, protected her, offered her a home and partnership was a wanted criminal. Everything between them had been built on deception. "So you ran," she said. "I ran. Took the little money I'd gotten and headed for the mountains. Changed my name, tried to become someone better than the man who'd robbed that bank. And did you?" Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "Become someone better?" Jacob met her eyes directly. "I thought so. Until a few minutes ago, I believed I had." Sheriff Bradley stepped forward with handcuffs, his expression sympathetic but determined. "Jacob, I'm sorry about this. You know I've got to take you back." "I know. Tom, just give me a minute with Sarah." Bradley nodded and moved a discreet distance away. Though he kept his hand near his weapon, Jacob turned to Sarah, and she could see the pain in his eyes. "I should have told you from the beginning about my past, about who I really was. You deserved to know what you were getting into." Sarah felt tears threatening, but she forced them back. "Why didn't you?" "Because I was a coward. Because I was afraid that if you knew the truth, you'd see me the way I saw myself, as someone who didn't deserve a second chance. And now," Jacob's smile was heartbreaking in its sadness, "now I realize I was right to be afraid. You trusted me, Sarah. You put your life in my hands, and I betrayed that trust by not being honest about who I was." Sarah looked around at the cabin, at the life they'd been building together, at the future that seemed to be crumbling around them. "What happens now? Now I go back to face what I should have faced 15 years ago." Jacob's voice caught. "You deserve better than being tied to a wanted criminal. Wheeler's offer still stands, and there might be others. Good men who can give you the life you deserve." "Don't," Sarah said sharply. "Don't you dare tell me what I deserve or what choices I should make. I've had enough of men doing that to last a lifetime." Jacob looked surprised by the steel in her voice. "You lied to me," Sarah continued, her voice shaking with emotion, "about something fundamental, something that could affect both our lives. That was wrong, and I'm angry about it. But I'm angrier about something else." "What?" "I'm angry that you think so little of me, of what we've built here, that you'd assume I'd abandon you the moment things got difficult." Jacob stared at her. "Sarah, you don't understand. I'm a criminal, a wanted man. Association with me could destroy your reputation, your future. My reputation was already destroyed the moment I was abandoned at the altar." Sarah interrupted. "My future was non-existent when I was searching through garbage for food. You gave me both of those things back, Jacob. Not Jake Thornton, not the man who robbed a bank 15 years ago, but the man who saw a stranger in need and chose to help." Sheriff Bradley cleared his throat. "Folks, I hate to interrupt, but we need to get moving. It's a long ride back to town." Sarah turned to the sheriff with desperate determination. "How long will he have before trial?" "Depends on when the territorial judge makes his circuit. Could be weeks, could be months, and if he's convicted." Bradley's expression was grim. "Bank robbery's a serious charge. Even an attempted one. He'd be looking at years in territorial prison, maybe worse." Sarah felt her world narrowing to a single point of clarity. Everything else, her fears, her doubts, her anger about Jacob's deception, became secondary to one overwhelming truth: she couldn't lose him now. "Sheriff," she said firmly, "I want to testify on Jacob's behalf, as a character witness." "Sarah, no," Jacob protested. "You'd be associating yourself publicly with a criminal case. It could ruin any chance you have of building a respectable life." Sarah walked over to the wanted poster Bradley had pulled from his pocket, studying the faded drawing that bore little resemblance to the man Jacob had become. The face in the sketch was younger, harder, marked by desperation and grief. The man standing before her now had lines of kindness around his eyes, hands that had learned gentleness, a heart that had found compassion again. "This Jake Thornton," she said, holding up the poster, "he's not the man I know. The man I know builds cabins for the future rather than stealing from the past. He rescues abandoned women instead of frightening bank tellers. He offers partnership instead of demanding subservience." She turned to face Jacob directly. "You think you've been lying to me about who you are, but you haven't. You've been showing me every day through your actions, your kindness, your integrity. That's who you really are now, whatever you might have been 15 years ago." Jacob's eyes filled with something that might have been hope. "Sarah, I'm not finished," she said, her voice growing stronger. "You asked me to trust you with my life, and I did. Now I'm asking you to trust me with yours. Don't give up on us, on what we've built, on what we could still build together." Sheriff Bradley stepped forward, clearly moved by Sarah's words but bound by duty. "This is all very touching, but I still have to take him in." "The law's the law. I understand," Sarah said. "But Sheriff, I want you to know that I'll be coming to town for the trial, and I'll be telling everyone who'll listen about the man Jacob Whitmore has become, not the desperate boy Jake Thornton used to be." Jacob looked at her with wonder and gratitude. "You'd do that? Even knowing what I've done?" Sarah moved to stand beside him, close enough to take his hand. "Especially knowing what you've done, because it makes what you've become that much more remarkable." As Sheriff Bradley prepared to place Jacob under arrest, Sarah remembered something that made her heart race with possibility. "Wait," she said suddenly. "Sheriff, you said Wheeler had witnesses claim Jacob threatened me. But what if I could prove those witnesses were lying? What if I could show that Wheeler has been threatening and coercing people himself?" Bradley paused, handcuffs half raised. "What do you mean?" Sarah's mind was working rapidly, putting together pieces of information she'd gathered over the past weeks. Clara, the widow Wheeler, was harassing. "She's not the only one, is she? I'll bet if you asked around you'd find other women he's pressured, other people he's threatened to get what he wants." "Maybe," Bradley said slowly. "But that doesn't change the charges against Jacob. But it might change how credible Wheeler's witnesses appear," Sarah pointed out. "If I can show that Wheeler has a pattern of threatening people to get what he wants, then his sudden concern for my welfare starts to look less noble and more self-serving." Jacob squeezed her hand. "Sarah, you're talking about taking on a powerful man with influential friends. It could be dangerous, more dangerous than losing you," she asked simply. Bradley was watching their exchange with growing interest. "Miss Mitchell, if you really believe you can prove Wheeler's been intimidating witnesses, I'd be obliged to investigate. But it would have to be solid evidence, not just accusations." Sarah nodded decisively. "Give me time to gather that evidence. Don't take Jacob to trial until I've had a chance to build a case. I can't just ignore a properly filed warrant. But you could hold him in the local jail while you investigate the circumstances of the charges," Sarah suggested. "That's reasonable, isn't it?" Bradley considered this, clearly torn between duty and fairness. Finally he nodded. "I suppose I could justify a few weeks for investigation, especially if new evidence comes to light about the complainant's credibility." Jacob looked between Sarah and the sheriff, hope and fear warring in his expression. "You really think this could work?" Sarah met his gaze steadily. "I think we owe it to ourselves to try. And I think Marcus Wheeler is about to discover that some women fight back harder when they're cornered." As Bradley prepared to escort Jacob down the mountain, Sarah made one more decision that surprised everyone, including herself. "Sheriff," she said, "I'm coming with you. I can't build a defense from up here, and Jacob shouldn't face this alone." "Sarah," Jacob protested, "you don't have to." "Yes, I do," she said firmly. "We're partners, remember? That means we face the hard times together, not just the easy ones." As they prepared to leave the cabin that had become their sanctuary, Sarah took one last look around at the life they'd begun to build together. The quilt she'd been working on lay half-finished on the table, its interlocking rings waiting for completion. She folded it carefully and tucked it into her bag. Whatever happened in the weeks to come, she would finish that quilt. And when she did, it would be a symbol not just of their partnership, but of their determination to weave something beautiful and lasting from the broken pieces of their pasts. The truth about Jacob's history had changed everything and nothing. The man she'd fallen in love with was still the same man, regardless of the name he'd once used, or the desperate act he'd committed in his darkest hour. And if Marcus Wheeler thought he could use the past to destroy their future, he was about to learn just how wrong he could be. Sarah Mitchell had been abandoned once before, and had survived. This time, she wouldn't just survive, she would fight. And she would win. The jail in Copper Creek was a modest affair, 2 cells in the back of Sheriff Bradley's office, separated by thick iron bars from a front room that served as both courthouse and administrative center. Jacob sat on the narrow cot, his father's rifle propped against the wall nearby where Bradley had placed it, not as evidence, but as a gesture of respect between men who understood each other. Sarah had taken a room at the Golden Creek Inn again, but she spent most of her time in the jail, working on what she called her case for the defense. The small table in Bradley's office was covered with papers, notes, and a growing collection of testimonies from people who had encountered Marcus Wheeler's particular brand of persuasion. "Tell me again about the Henderson farm," Sarah said. Looking up from her careful handwriting, Mrs. Ruth Henderson, a weather-beaten woman in her 60s, shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Like I said, after my husband died, Wheeler started coming around. Said I couldn't manage the place on my own, that I needed a man's protection. When I told him I wasn't interested in remarrying, he got persistent." How persistent? Mrs. Henderson glanced toward the cells where Jacob was listening quietly. "Said accidents happen to women living alone. Said my cattle might wander onto his property and get shot as strays. Said the bank might have questions about my husband's outstanding loans." Sarah's pen moved rapidly across the paper. "And did these things happen? Lost 6 head of cattle to straying last fall. Bank called in a loan that had been in good standing for 5 years. My well went dry overnight. Turned out someone had diverted the stream that fed it upstream." Sarah looked up sharply. "Someone diverted your water?" "Couldn't prove it was Wheeler, but it happened right after I told him final-like that I wouldn't marry him." Funny coincidence. From his cell, Jacob spoke quietly. "Water rights are serious business in this territory. Interfering with someone's water source is a federal crime." Sarah made another note, her determination growing stronger with each story she collected. Over the past 2 weeks, she'd spoken with 5 women who had similar tales, widows and single women who had faced Wheeler's protection and experienced mysterious difficulties when they refused his advances. "Mrs. Henderson," Sarah said gently, "would you be willing to testify to these facts in court?" The older woman's face paled. "I don't know, miss. Wheeler's got a lot of influence. Speaking against him publicly, it could make things worse for me." Sarah understood the fear, but she pressed on. "What if I told you there were other women with similar stories? What if you weren't alone in speaking out?" Hope flickered in Mrs. Henderson's eyes. "Others would testify too? If we stand together, it's harder for any one person to be singled out for retaliation." After Mrs. Henderson left, Sheriff Bradley poured coffee for Sarah and Jacob, his expression thoughtful. "You're building a strong case about Wheeler's character, but I'm not sure how it helps with the charges against Jacob." Sarah looked up from her notes. "It goes to credibility. If I can show that Wheeler has a pattern of using threats and intimidation to get what he wants, then his sudden concern for my welfare looks less like moral outrage and more like another manipulation tactic." "The judge might see it that way," Bradley agreed cautiously. "But he might also say Wheeler's past behavior doesn't change the facts about Jacob's identity." Jacob had been quiet through most of these planning sessions, but now he spoke up. "Sarah, you've done more than anyone could ask. But Tom's right. Even if you discredit Wheeler completely, I'm still Jake Thornton. I still robbed that bank." Sarah set down her pen and walked to the cell, wrapping her fingers around the bars. "Yes, you did. 15 years ago, in a moment of desperation and grief. But the man who committed that crime and the man you've become since, they're not the same person. The law might not see it that way." "Then we'll help the law understand," Sarah said firmly. "Jacob, do you remember what you told me about mountain survival? About thinking ahead, planning for problems before they happen?" "Of course. Well, I've been thinking ahead. And I realized that Wheeler made a mistake when he dug into your past." Both Jacob and Bradley looked at her with interest. "He found Jake Thornton, the bank robber," Sarah continued. "But he didn't find the whole story. He didn't find out what happened after the robbery, who you became, what you did with your life." Jacob frowned. "What do you mean?" Sarah pulled a stack of letters from her bag. "I've been corresponding with people who knew you during your mountain years. The trapper who taught you to read weather signs. The Cheyenne elder who shared hunting wisdom with you. The traveling preacher you helped through a blizzard 5 winters ago." She spread the letters on the table. "Dr. Marcus Webb from Billings, remember him? You guided his family to safety when they got lost in a storm. He's written a letter describing how you refused payment, how you insisted that helping fellow travelers was just what decent people did." Jacob stared at the letters in amazement. "How did you find all these people?" "Mountain men have a network," Sarah smiled. "Word travels along trading routes, through trading posts, among people who understand what it means to survive in the wilderness. I sent letters to every post within 100 miles, asking if anyone knew Jacob Whitmore." She picked up another letter. "This is from Father Miguel at the mission in Helena. You brought him medical supplies during a diphtheria outbreak 3 years ago, remember? Rode 2 days through dangerous territory to help people you'd never met." Bradley was reading over her shoulder. "These are impressive testimonials, Miss Mitchell. But will the judge consider them relevant?" "They have to be relevant," Sarah said passionately. "The law isn't just about punishment, it's about justice. And justice requires looking at the whole person, not just their worst moment." Jacob's voice was thick with emotion. "Sarah, I can't believe you did all this." "I told you we were partners," she replied simply. "Partners don't abandon each other when times get hard." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Martha Hennessy entered, carrying a basket that smelled wonderfully of fresh bread and stew. "Thought you all might be hungry," she said, setting the basket on Bradley's desk. "And I wanted to let you know, there's been talk around town about the trial." Sarah looked up sharply. "What kind of talk?" "Mixed, mostly. Wheeler's been telling anyone who'll listen that Jacob's a dangerous criminal who's been deceiving everyone. But some folks remember the good things Jacob's done over the years. Fair dealings at the trading post, help during emergencies, that sort of thing. What do you think, Martha?" Jacob asked quietly. "Honestly," Martha considered the question seriously, "I think people are willing to listen to both sides, if both sides get a fair hearing. Wheeler's got influence, but he doesn't own everyone's conscience." After Martha left, Sarah returned to her preparations with renewed energy. She organized testimonials, prepared questions for witnesses, and worked on what she hoped would be a compelling argument for redemption and second chances. "There's something else we need to discuss," she said as evening approached. "The question of what happens after the trial." Jacob looked up from the book he'd been reading. "What do you mean?" "I mean that regardless of the outcome, our lives are going to be different. If you're acquitted, we can return to the mountain, but people will know who you used to be. If you're convicted," Sarah's voice caught slightly. "If you're convicted, I need to know what you want me to do with your property, your belongings." Jacob was quiet for a long moment. "Sarah, I've been thinking about something. If the worst happens, if I'm sent to prison, I want you to have the cabin, the land, everything. It's all yours." "Jacob, no." "Yes," he said firmly. "You've given me something I thought I'd lost forever, the belief that I'm worth fighting for. Win or lose, you've already given me more than I deserve." Sarah felt tears threaten, but she pushed them back. "Don't talk like that. We're going to win this. Maybe, but if we don't, promise me you'll take the land and make something good of it. Build the life you deserve, whether I'm there or not." Before Sarah could respond, Sheriff Bradley returned from his evening rounds with news that made both their hearts race. "Got word from the territorial courthouse," he announced. "Judge Morrison will be here day after tomorrow to hear the case. He's known for being fair but strict about the law." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and terror. 2 days. Is that enough time to prepare?" "It has to be," Bradley said. "Wheeler's lawyer arrived this afternoon, some fancy fellow from Helena with a reputation for winning difficult cases." Jacob stood up, gripping the cell bars. "Sarah, you don't have to go through with this. You could still change your mind, distance yourself from the case." Sarah looked at him steadily. "Jacob Whitmore, do you trust me? With my life, then trust me to fight for that life. Trust me to stand up in that courtroom and tell the truth about the man you've become. Trust me to prove that redemption is real and second chances matter." Jacob nodded slowly. "All right. I trust you. As Sarah gathered her papers and prepared to return to the inn for the night, she felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. In 2 days, she would stand before a territorial judge and argue not just for Jacob's freedom, but for the principle that people could change, grow, become better than their worst moments. She thought of the quilt waiting in her room, its interlocking rings still incomplete. Tomorrow night she would finish it, regardless of what the next day brought. Because whether they won or lost, whether they returned to the mountain together or faced separation, she would complete what they had started. The pattern would hold. The design would be beautiful, and the warmth it provided would last long after the coldest winter had passed. Justice, Sarah had learned, was like quilting. It required patience, precision, and the unwavering belief that individual pieces, no matter how flawed, could be woven together into something stronger and more beautiful than any single element could be alone. The makeshift courtroom in Copper Creek's community hall buzzed with an energy Sarah had never experienced before. Judge Morrison, a stern man with silver hair and penetrating blue eyes, sat behind the borrowed desk that served as his bench. To his right, the court clerk shuffled papers with official importance. To his left, Sheriff Bradley stood ready to maintain order. Sarah sat in the front row, her carefully prepared notes spread before her. She had chosen her best dress, the blue one Jacob had bought her that first day, and pinned her mother's locket at her throat for courage. Beside her sat the women who had agreed to testify about Wheeler's pattern of intimidation. Mrs. Henderson, Clara, who had returned from Denver specifically for the trial, and 3 other widows whose stories painted a disturbing picture of systematic harassment. Across the aisle, Marcus Wheeler sat with his expensive lawyer, Mr. Dalton, from Helena. Wheeler looked confident, his tailored suit and careful grooming marking him as a man of substance and respectability. Next to him sat Mrs. Hartwell and her daughter Agnes, the witnesses who claimed to have overheard Jacob threatening Sarah. Jacob had been brought from his cell, clean-shaven and wearing his best clothes, but the shackles around his wrists marked him clearly as the accused. When his eyes met Sarah's, she saw gratitude, fear, and something else, a quiet dignity that no amount of legal maneuvering could diminish. Judge Morrison called the court to order with 3 sharp raps of his gavel. We are here today to consider charges of kidnapping and corruption of morals filed against the defendant, who has been identified as both Jacob Whitmore and Jake Thornton. Mr. Dalton, you may present the prosecution's case. Wheeler's lawyer stood with theatrical precision, his voice carrying the authority of expensive legal education. Your Honor, the facts in this case are straightforward. The defendant, using the false identity of Jacob Whitmore, lured an innocent young woman into an isolated mountain location where she was held against her will and subjected to immoral circumstances. Sarah felt anger rise in her chest, but forced herself to remain calm. This was just the beginning. We will show, Dalton continued, that the defendant is actually Jake Thornton, a wanted criminal who robbed a bank in Denver 15 years ago and has been evading justice ever since. We will demonstrate that Miss Mitchell was coerced into accompanying him through threats and manipulation, and we will prove that the defendant's true motive was not charity, but the corruption of an innocent woman for his own base purposes. Dalton gestured toward the Hartwells. We have witnesses who heard the defendant threaten Miss Mitchell, warning her of terrible consequences if she refused his protection. We have evidence of his criminal past that shows a pattern of taking what doesn't belong to him. And we have the undeniable fact that he held this young woman in an isolated location with no means of escape or contact with civilized society. The lawyer sat down with satisfied confidence. Sarah could see the effect his words had on the packed courtroom. Murmurs of concern, disapproving looks directed at Jacob. Wheeler had chosen his representative well. Judge Morrison turned to Sarah. Miss Mitchell, I understand you are representing the defendant in this matter. Are you prepared to present your case? Sarah stood on shaking legs, her mouth suddenly dry. She had never spoken in a courtroom before, never faced a judge or argued a legal case. But as she looked at Jacob, at the man who had saved her life and taught her to believe in herself, she found her voice. Your Honor, the prosecution would have you believe that Jacob Whitmore is a dangerous criminal who preys on innocent women. I intend to prove not only that these charges are false, but that they represent a deliberate attempt by Marcus Wheeler to use the legal system to force an unwanted marriage. A ripple of surprise went through the courtroom. Wheeler's face flushed red, but his lawyer remained impassive. I will show, Sarah continued, gaining confidence, that Mr. Wheeler has a documented pattern of threatening and intimidating single women in this community. I will demonstrate that the witnesses against Jacob have been coerced or misled. And I will prove that Jacob Whitmore, whatever his past may have been, has spent the last 15 years living as an honorable man who has helped countless people and hurt no one. Sarah sat down, her heart pounding. Judge Morrison studied her with interest. Clearly, he hadn't expected such a direct challenge to the prosecution's case. Mr. Dalton, call your first witness. Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell took the witness chair with obvious nervousness. She was a thin woman in her 40s, dressed in severe black clothing that emphasized her pinched features. Mrs. Hartwell, Dalton began smoothly, please tell the court what you witnessed at the Golden Creek Inn. Well, I was staying there during the terrible storm, and I couldn't help but overhear a conversation between that man, she pointed at Jacob, and Miss Mitchell. What did you hear? Mrs. Hartwell's voice grew stronger as she warmed to her testimony. He was telling her about all the terrible things that could happen to a woman alone in a frontier town, about how she needed his protection, how she'd regret it if she didn't accept his offer. It sounded very much like a threat to me. And how did Miss Mitchell respond? She seemed frightened, overwhelmed, like she didn't have any choice but to go with him. Dalton nodded approvingly. Thank you, Mrs. Hartwell. Judge Morrison looked at Sarah. Your witness, Miss Mitchell. Sarah stood, her hands steady now. She had spent hours preparing for this moment. Mrs. Hartwell, you said you overheard this conversation. Where exactly were you when it took place? In the common room of the inn. And where were Jacob and I? Mrs. Hartwell, Sarah continued gently but firmly, have you ever had any business dealings with Marcus Wheeler? Dalton jumped to his feet. Objection! Irrelevant to the charges. Your Honor, Sarah said, it goes to the witness's credibility and potential bias. Judge Morrison considered this. I'll allow it. Answer the question, Mrs. Hartwell. The woman's face went pale. Mr. Wheeler holds the mortgage on my late husband's farm. And is that mortgage current? I've fallen behind on some payments. How far behind? Your Honor, Dalton interrupted, this line of questioning is directly relevant to whether this witness has been coerced, Sarah said firmly. Mrs. Hartwell, how far behind are you on your mortgage payments? 3 months, the woman whispered. And what did Mr. Wheeler tell you would happen to those payments if you testified in this case? Mrs. Hartwell looked desperately toward Wheeler, who was staring at her with barely concealed anger. He said that if I helped establish the facts about what happened at the inn, he might be able to work with me on the payments. A murmur went through the courtroom. Sarah pressed her advantage. So your testimony here today could mean the difference between keeping your farm and losing it. Yes, Mrs. Hartwell admitted, tears forming in her eyes. And if your testimony doesn't satisfy Mr. Wheeler, I could lose everything. Sarah turned to face the courtroom. Your Honor, I submit that this witness has been coerced into providing testimony that supports Marcus Wheeler's version of events, under threat of losing her home. Judge Morrison's expression had grown stern. Mr. Dalton, do you wish to redirect? Wheeler's lawyer stood, but his confidence had visibly shaken. No further questions, Your Honor. As Mrs. Hartwell stepped down, clearly distraught, Sarah felt the momentum in the courtroom shift. She had drawn first blood, exposing the prosecution's key witness as compromised. But she knew the hardest part was still ahead. Judge Morrison consulted his notes. Mr. Dalton, your next witness. The prosecution calls Agnes Hartwell. Agnes was younger than her mother, perhaps 25, but she carried the same nervous energy. As she settled into the witness chair, Sarah noticed how her eyes kept darting toward Wheeler with obvious fear. "Miss Hartwell," Dalton began, "did you also witness the conversation between the defendant and Miss Mitchell?" "Yes, sir. And what was your impression of what you heard?" Agnes spoke as if reciting a rehearsed speech. "The man was clearly threatening Miss Mitchell. He told her that bad things happened to women who didn't accept protection. He made it sound like she had no choice but to go with him." Sarah watched the young woman carefully, noting the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands gripped the chair arms. This was not the testimony of someone telling the truth. This was the performance of someone who had been coached and frightened into compliance. When Sarah's turn came to cross-examine, she stood slowly, her voice gentle but probing. "Miss Hartwell, you're not married, are you?" "No, ma'am. And you live on your mother's farm?" "Yes. That must be difficult, trying to manage a farm with just the two of you." Agnes nodded, some of the tension leaving her shoulders at Sarah's sympathetic tone. "Have you ever had occasion to meet Marcus Wheeler before this trial?" Agnes glanced nervously toward Wheeler. "Yes, ma'am." "Under what circumstances?" He came to our farm several times over the past few months." "What did he want?" "He said he was concerned about two women trying to manage alone. He offered to help." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "What kind of help?" "He said he could provide protection, that he was looking for a wife, someone to help manage his household." The courtroom was completely silent now, everyone hanging on Agnes's words. "And how did you respond to his offer?" Agnes's voice became smaller. "I told him I wasn't interested, that I needed to take care of my mother." "How did Mr. Wheeler react to your refusal?" Agnes looked directly at Wheeler, and for the first time there was defiance in her eyes. "He said that women who refused reasonable offers of protection often found themselves in difficult situations. He said accidents happened to isolated farms." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Morrison banged his gavel for order. "Miss Hartwell," Sarah continued, "are you testifying today because you believe Jacob threatened me, or because Marcus Wheeler threatened you?" Agnes Hartwell broke down completely, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "He said if we didn't testify the way he wanted, we'd lose the farm." "I'm so sorry." Sarah looked at Judge Morrison, seeing understanding and growing anger in the older man's eyes. The prosecution's case was crumbling, and everyone in the courtroom could see it. But Sarah knew that discrediting Wheeler's witnesses was only half the battle. She still had to prove that Jacob Whitmore deserved a second chance, that redemption was possible, and that love could triumph over the darkest parts of the past. The real fight was just beginning. Judge Morrison called a brief recess after Agnes Hartwell's breakdown, and the courtroom buzzed with conversation as people processed what they had just witnessed. Sarah used the time to organize her thoughts and prepare for the most crucial part of the trial, proving that Jacob Whitmore deserved redemption. When court reconvened, Mr. Dalton looked considerably less confident than he had that morning. Still, he pressed forward with his case. "Your Honor," he said, "regardless of any questions about witness motivation, the fundamental facts remain unchanged. The defendant is Jake Thornton, a wanted criminal who robbed a bank 15 years ago. He has been living under an assumed identity, evading justice. These facts alone warrant conviction." Judge Morrison nodded thoughtfully. "Mr. Dalton, do you have evidence beyond the witness testimony we've already heard?" "Yes, Your Honor. I present this wanted poster from Denver, dated 15 years ago, and this affidavit from the Denver City Bank confirming that Jake Thornton stole approximately $50 from their establishment in 1869. Dalton placed the documents before the judge. Sarah's heart sank as she saw the official seals and formal language that made Jacob's past crimes undeniably real and legally documented. "I also present this statement from a Pinkerton detective who has confirmed that the defendant's fingerprints match those of Jake Thornton. The weight of evidence seemed overwhelming. Even with Wheeler's credibility destroyed, the core charges remained. Jacob was indeed a wanted criminal who had evaded justice for 15 years. Judge Morrison studied the documents carefully. "Miss Mitchell, how do you respond to this evidence?" Sarah stood, knowing that everything depended on the next few minutes. Your Honor, I don't dispute that Jacob Whitmore was once Jake Thornton, or that Jake Thornton committed a crime 15 years ago. But I ask this court to consider not just what he did in his darkest hour, but what he has done every day since then to make amends. She walked to her table and picked up the stack of letters she had collected. I would like to call Dr. Marcus Webb as a witness. A distinguished man in his 50s stood from the gallery. Sarah had sent word to him, and he had ridden 3 days to testify. Dr. Webb, Sarah began, please tell the court about your encounter with Jacob Whitmore 5 years ago. Dr. Webb spoke with quiet authority. My family and I were traveling to a new medical posting when we were caught in a severe blizzard. We were lost, freezing, and my youngest daughter was showing signs of frostbite. Jacob Whitmore found us and guided us to safety, sharing his own supplies and shelter. Without his help, we would have died. Did he ask for payment? I offered him everything I had. He refused to take a penny, saying that helping fellow travelers was just what people did in the mountains. Sarah nodded and called her next witness, Father Miguel from the Helena mission. An elderly priest rose, his weathered face kind but serious. Jacob Whitmore rode 2 days through dangerous territory to bring medical supplies during a diphtheria outbreak at our mission 3 years ago. He risked his life to help people he had never met, including several Cheyenne children. When I tried to bless him for his kindness, he said he was just trying to balance the scales. He said he had done harm in his past and was trying to make up for it through good works. It was clear to me that this was a man seeking redemption through service to others. Sarah called 3 more witnesses: the trapper who had taught Jacob wilderness skills, a traveling merchant Jacob had rescued from outlaws, and an elderly Cheyenne elder named Two Hawks who spoke through an interpreter about Jacob's respect for the land and its people. This man you call Jacob Whitmore, Two Hawks said in halting English. He understands the old ways. He takes only what he needs, gives back more than he takes. The mountains have taught him wisdom that many white men never learn. When Sarah's witnesses had finished, the courtroom was silent. She could see the effect their testimonies had on the crowd. These were respected members of the community, speaking about Jacob's character with genuine gratitude and respect. Judge Morrison looked thoughtful. Miss Mitchell, these testimonials speak well of the defendant's character in recent years. But the law is clear about fugitives from justice. Good deeds don't erase criminal acts. Sarah took a deep breath. This was the moment she had prepared for, the argument she hoped would save Jacob's life and their future together. Your Honor, may I address the court directly? You may. Sarah moved to stand before the judge's bench, her voice carrying clearly through the packed room. Your Honor, 15 years ago, a man named Jake Thornton walked into a bank with a gun and desperation in his heart. He had lost his wife and child to disease, lost his farm to creditors, lost everything that gave his life meaning. In that moment of crushing grief and rage, he made a terrible choice. She paused, looking around the courtroom. But that same man, when faced with a terrified bank teller who reminded him of his dead wife, couldn't go through with his planned robbery. He took $50, barely enough to buy supplies, and fled, not because he was a hardened criminal, but because he was horrified by what he had almost become. Sarah pulled out the marriage certificate she had prepared, though she and Jacob hadn't yet had a ceremony, Your Honor. I ask this court to consider not just the crime Jake Thornton committed, but the man Jacob Whitmore became. For 15 years, he has lived a life of service and integrity. He has saved lives, helped strangers, and asked for nothing in return. He has paid his debt to society, not through time in prison, but through a lifetime of good works. Judge Morrison examined the marriage certificate with surprise. Miss Mitchell, are you and the defendant married? Sarah felt her face flush, but she answered honestly, Not yet, Your Honor, but we are engaged to be married. And I wanted the court to understand that I am not a victim of Jacob's crimes. I am a partner in his redemption. You would marry a known criminal? I would marry a man who has proven that people can change, that redemption is possible, that our worst moments don't have to define us forever. Sarah turned to face the courtroom, addressing not just the judge, but everyone who had gathered to witness this trial. 15 years ago, I was a child safe in my parents' home. Jacob was a broken man who made a desperate choice. But life has brought us together now, and I see not the criminal he was, but the man he chose to become. If this court sends him to prison, you will be punishing not just his past crimes, but destroying his future redemption. She faced the judge again. Your Honor, I ask you to sentence Jacob to time served, these past weeks in jail, and to community service. Let him continue the good work he has been doing for 15 years. Let him prove that justice can include mercy, and that second chances can create better citizens than punishment alone. The courtroom was absolutely silent when Sarah finished. She could see tears in several faces, including Martha's. Even some of Wheeler's supporters looked moved by her plea. Judge Morrison was quiet for a long time, studying the documents before him. Finally he spoke. Mr. Whitmore, please stand. Jacob rose, his shackles clanking softly. Sarah held her breath. Mr. Whitmore, you are indeed Jake Thornton, wanted for bank robbery in Denver 15 years ago. Do you admit to this crime? Yes, Your Honor, Jacob said quietly. I do. And do you have anything to say in your defense? Jacob looked at Sarah, then back at the judge. Your Honor, I can't undo what I did 15 years ago. I can't give back the money I stole or erase the fear I caused that bank teller. But I can tell you that every day since then, I have tried to live in a way that honors the man I wanted to be instead of the man I was in that dark moment. He paused, his voice growing stronger. I fell in love with a woman who sees the good in people even when they can't see it themselves. She taught me that redemption isn't something you earn once. It's something you choose every day. If this court gives me the chance, I will spend the rest of my life proving worthy of her faith and your mercy. Judge Morrison nodded slowly. Mr. Dalton, do you wish to make a closing statement? Wheeler's lawyer stood, but his earlier confidence had completely evaporated. Your Honor, the prosecution stands by its evidence of the defendant's criminal past. Miss Mitchell, your closing statement. Sarah stood one final time, her voice filled with quiet conviction. Your Honor, this case is about more than one man's crime or one woman's love. It's about whether we believe people can change, whether we think redemption is possible, whether justice includes the hope of second chances. Jacob Whitmore has spent 15 years proving that the answer to all those questions is yes. I ask this court to let him continue proving it for 15 more. Judge Morrison called for a recess while he considered his verdict. Sarah sat with Jacob in the brief time they were allowed together, holding his shackled hands in hers. Whatever happens, he said quietly, you gave me something beautiful. You made me believe I was worth fighting for. You are worth fighting for, Sarah replied. And this isn't over yet. When court reconvened, Judge Morrison's expression was unreadable. The entire town seemed to hold its breath as he prepared to announce Jacob's fate, and with it, the future of the love that had grown between a mountain man and the woman who had seen his true heart beneath the shadows of his past. Judge Morrison stood slowly, his weathered hands resting on the makeshift bench as he surveyed the packed courtroom. The weight of his decision seemed to settle on his shoulders like a heavy cloak, and Sarah found herself holding her breath as she waited for words that would determine not just Jacob's fate, but the future they had dared to dream together. In my 30 years serving as a territorial judge, Morrison began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room, I have seen men destroyed by their worst moments and men redeemed by their best ones. Today, this court has heard evidence of both. He picked up the wanted poster, studying the faded sketch of Jake Thornton. There is no question that the defendant committed a crime 15 years ago. Bank robbery is a serious offense that endangered innocent people and violated the trust upon which civilized society depends. Sarah's heart sank, but the judge continued. However, this court has also heard compelling evidence that Jake Thornton died in the mountains 15 years ago. and from his ashes rose a man named Jacob Whitmore, a man who has spent a decade and a half atoning for his past. Through service to others, Judge Morrison set down the poster and picked up the letters of testimony Sarah had collected. So the law exists not merely to punish past crimes, but to protect society and, where possible, to transform wrongdoers into productive citizens. By that measure, Jacob Whitmore represents not the failure of justice, but its greatest success. A murmur of hope rippled through the courtroom. Sarah felt tears gathering in her eyes, but refused to let them fall until she heard the final verdict. However, the judge continued, I cannot simply ignore 15 years of evading legal responsibility. Therefore, this court finds the defendant guilty of the charges against him. Sarah's heart plummeted. But Judge Morrison raised his hand for silence. But in consideration of the extraordinary evidence of redemption, the defendant's obvious remorse, and the compelling testimony of those whose lives he has saved, this court sentences Jacob Whitmore to time served plus 100 hours of community service to be performed in Copper Creek under Sheriff Bradley's supervision. The courtroom erupted in cheers and applause. Sarah felt her knees give way as relief flooded through her, but Jacob caught her before she could fall, his shackles forgotten as he wrapped his arms around her. Judge Morrison banged his gavel for order. Furthermore, he announced when the room quieted, given the evidence of coercion and intimidation presented regarding the prosecution's witnesses, this court orders a full investigation into Marcus Wheeler's business practices and his treatment of vulnerable women in this community. Wheeler's face went pale as Sheriff Bradley moved toward him. Mr. Wheeler, you'll need to come with me for questioning about the witness tampering allegations. As Wheeler was led away, protesting his innocence, Sarah found herself surrounded by well-wishers. Martha embraced her tearfully. Dr. Webb shook Jacob's hand with genuine warmth, and even some of the townspeople who had been skeptical earlier offered congratulations. You did it, Jacob whispered in Sarah's ear as Sheriff Bradley removed his shackles. I don't know how, but you did it. We did it, Sarah corrected. Together, 3 months later, on a warm spring morning that painted the mountains in shades of gold and green, Sarah and Jacob stood before Father Miguel in the small church of Copper Creek. The sanctuary was packed with friends and well-wishers, people whose lives Jacob had touched during his years of quiet service, and others who had come to witness what had become a local legend. Sarah wore a new wedding dress, simple but elegant, made from fabric she had sewn herself during the long winter evenings. The pattern reminded her of her mother's favorite design, but the execution was entirely her own. Jacob stood beside her in his best suit, clean-shaven and nervous. Looking younger than his years, do you, Jacob Whitmore, take Sarah to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live? Jacob's voice was strong and clear. I do. And do you, Sarah Mitchell, take Jacob to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live? Sarah looked into Jacob's eyes, seeing not the desperate man who had robbed a bank 15 years ago, but the gentle soul who had rescued her from despair and taught her to believe in second chances. I do. Father Miguel smiled as he pronounced them husband and wife. You may kiss your bride. Jacob's kiss was tender and full of promise, tasting of hope and the future they would build together. When they broke apart, the church erupted in celebration, and Sarah laughed through tears of pure joy. The reception was held in the community hall, where Jacob's trial had taken place just months before. The same room that had witnessed accusations and judgment now rang with laughter and music. Martha had prepared a feast. The local musicians played cheerful melodies, and even Judge Morrison had returned for the occasion. Quite a transformation from our last meeting here, the judge observed. To Sarah as they shared a dance. Everything can be transformed with enough love and patience, Sarah replied. That's what Jacob taught me. As evening approached, Jacob and Sarah prepared to return to their mountain home. The cabin had been expanded over the winter. Jacob's community service had included helping several local families with construction projects, and they had returned the favor by adding a proper bedroom and enlarged kitchen to the Whitmore homestead. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Whitmore?" Jacob asked, helping Sarah into the wagon. Sarah smiled at the sound of her new name. "I've been ready since the day I met you." The ride up the mountain was peaceful, filled with comfortable conversation and shared silence. When they crested the ridge overlooking Paradise Valley, Sarah gasped at the beauty of the scene below. The meadows were carpeted with wildflowers. The stream ran clear and swift with snowmelt, and their cabin looked like something from a fairy tale. "Welcome home," Jacob said, echoing his words from their first visit. Inside the cabin, Sarah found that Jacob had prepared a surprise. The quilt she had been working on during those uncertain weeks, the one with interlocking rings that had symbolized their growing partnership, was completed and spread across their marriage. "Bed, when did you finish it?" she asked in wonder. "During those long nights in jail, Martha brought me your sewing kit, and I worked on it by lamplight. I wanted it to be ready for our wedding night." Sarah ran her hands over the intricate pattern, marveling at the neat, careful stitches that Jacob had added to her own work. It was beautiful in its imperfection, some rings slightly uneven, some colors not quite matching, but it was theirs. Created together through patience and love. "It's perfect," she whispered, that night, as they lay beneath the quilt they had created together. Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, she had been a desperate woman searching through garbage for scraps of food. Jacob had been a lonely hermit, convinced that his past disqualified him from happiness. Now, they were partners in the truest sense, two imperfect people who had chosen to build something beautiful. From the broken pieces of their histories, "Are you happy?" Jacob asked, his arm tightening around her. Sarah considered the question seriously. Happiness felt too small a word for what she felt. "Contentment, joy, fulfillment, hope, all of these and more. I'm complete," she said finally. "For the first time in my life, I feel complete." Outside their window, the mountains stood eternal and watchful, guardians of the valley, where two lost souls had found each other and built a love strong enough to weather any storm. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, and somewhere in the distance, a nightbird called to its mate with a song of pure joy. In the morning, they would begin their life together in earnest, tending their garden, caring for their animals, welcoming the occasional traveler who needed shelter or help. Jacob would continue his quiet works of service, and Sarah would teach the children of families who settled in the growing valley. But tonight, they simply held each other under the quilt that represented their journey from desperation to hope, from loneliness to love, from broken pasts to a shared future bright with possibility. The mountain man had come to town for supplies and found something far more precious than anything money could buy. And the hungry bride, who had searched through trash for bread, had discovered that the greatest nourishment came not from food, but from the love of someone who saw her true worth. Together, they had learned that redemption was real, that second chances could bloom into lasting happiness, and that sometimes the most beautiful love stories began with the simplest act of human kindness, one person choosing to help another when help was needed most. In Paradise Valley, where the wildflowers bloomed eternal and the streams ran clear and cold, Jacob and Sarah Whitmore settled into the rhythm of a life built on love, forgiveness, and the unwavering belief that every person deserved the chance to become better than their worst moment. And they lived, if not happily ever after, then happily enough, which, as any wise person knows, is the very best kind of happiness there is.